Somewhere off the coast of a small Greek island, a man is lying face down on a beach, half-drowned, sand caked into his beard, salt water still leaking out of his lungs. He has been at sea for 17 days. He has lost his ship, his crew, his armor, everything he owns except the rags on his back. And yet in a few hours he is going to wake up, wring the water out of his hair, and calmly introduce himself to a princess as though he were simply a traveler who had taken a wrong turn. That man has already survived a war that lasted 10 years. He has already tricked a one-eyed giant into drinking himself into a stupor. He has already sailed past creatures that most sailors only heard about in whispered stories, the kind you tell late at night when the wind is doing something strange outside. He still has 10 more years of wandering ahead of him before he ever sees his own home again. Tonight, we are going to follow that man from the smoking ruins of a city on the coast of Turkey all the way back to a quiet olive orchard on a small rocky island in the Ionian Sea. We are going to slow everything down. No shouting, no rushing. Just firelight, salt air, the creak of old ships, and the long, patient story of a man who used his mind instead of his sword whenever he possibly could. Hey, buddy. Welcome back. If this is your first time here, get comfortable because that is really the whole point of what we do. We are not here to give you a fast, exciting highlight reel. We are here to slow things down until your body forgets it is supposed to be doing anything else tonight except resting. So go ahead and get into whatever position feels good. Pull the blanket up. Dim the light if you have not already. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. There is nowhere else you need to be for the next little while. Tonight we are traveling back roughly 3,000 years, into a world of bronze swords, wine-dark seas, and gods who behaved a great deal like difficult relatives at a family gathering. We are going to spend our evening with Odysseus, king of a small, rugged island called Ithaca, a man whose story was first sung aloud by traveling poets long before anyone thought to write it down. Eventually, in Greece, someone did write it down, and we now call it the Odyssey. It is one of the oldest pieces of storytelling that has survived to reach us today, and it has been comforting, thrilling, and occasionally terrifying listeners for something like 28 centuries. Before we start walking through the story itself, I want to take a moment to ask you a small favor. If you are enjoying this kind of slow, immersive history, one that treats old myths and old lives with real care and detail, consider subscribing to the channel. It does not cost you anything, and it genuinely helps keep these long, quiet stories coming. You do not need to do it right now. You can drift off tonight and take care of it another time. I just wanted to mention it while we are still near the beginning, before your eyes get too heavy. Now, before we get into Odysseus himself, I think it helps to sit for a moment in the world he came from, because it was such a different way of living than anything we know now. So let us start there, in a small farming and fishing kingdom on a rocky island, before any of the famous adventures had even begun. Let's go inside. A king on a rocky island, Ithaca, was never one of the great kingdoms of the ancient Greek world. It was small, hilly, and covered more in rock and scrub than in fertile farmland. If you have ever stood on a rugged coastline where the wind never quite stops and the soil between the stones is thin and stubborn, you have some sense of what this island might have felt like underfoot. The historical Bronze Age Greeks who inspired these stories lived in a world without paper, without coined money, without maps as we would recognize them. A kingdom like Ithaca might have had only a few thousand people living across it, most of them farmers, herders, and fishermen, with the king's household sitting at the center of everything, not because it was enormous, but because it was where decisions were made, where grain was stored, where guests were received, and where the community gathered when something needed to be settled. I want you to imagine one particular morning on that island, years before the war that would change everything. The sun has not fully cleared the hills yet, and the air still carries the damp coolness of night. Smoke is beginning to rise from a handful of hearths scattered across the hillsides, thin gray threads climbing into a pale sky. Somewhere below, goats are complaining about being moved from one patch of scrub to another, their bells clunking dully with each step. A woman is already awake, kneeling at a loom that takes up most of one wall of her home, her fingers moving through wool threads that were spun by hand from fleece sheared months earlier. Weaving was not a hobby in this world. It was hours of daily, essential labor, the only way a household produced its own cloth, and a skilled weaver was valued and respected in a very real, practical sense. Down near the shore, fishermen are checking nets they wove themselves from flax fiber, mending small tiers with quick, practiced motions before the boats go out. The boats themselves were not large. Most were simple vessels built from planks of wood sewn or pegged together, sealed with pitch to keep the sea out, powered by oars and a single square sail when the wind cooperated. There was no reliable way to know exactly how far you had traveled, or how fast, except by watching landmarks along the coast and by feel, developed over years on the water. Sailors of this era hugged the coastline whenever they could, only venturing into open water when they had no other choice, because open water without landmarks was, quite honestly, terrifying. You could lose your bearings within a single overcast day. This was the world into which Odysseus was born, the son of a king named Laertes and a queen named Anticlea. As a boy, he would have grown up learning to handle boats, to hunt in the rough hills that made up much of the island, to listen carefully when his elders spoke of the wider world beyond the horizon, a world made up of dozens of small kingdoms scattered across the Greek mainland and its islands, each with its own king, its own local customs, and its own uneasy relationships with its neighbors. One detail from his early life that storytellers love to include, and one worth pausing on, is the story of how Odysseus got the scar that later helped identify him after decades away from home. As a young man, he went on a boar hunt with his mother's family on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, a real, physically imposing mountain on the Greek mainland. Boar hunting in this period was not the safe, ceremonial activity it might sound like. Wild boars in ancient Greece were large, powerfully built animals with tusks capable of opening a man's leg to the bone in an instant. Hunting one required patience, nerve, and a willingness to stand your ground at exactly the wrong moment. During that hunt, a boar gored Odysseus above the knee before the animal was finally brought down. The wound healed, but it left a scar that would stay with him his entire life, a small, permanent reminder etched into his skin of a moment when death had come close and simply missed. I want you to imagine the texture of an ordinary evening in that household on Ithaca, sometime in these early years, long before ships were being built for war. The hearth in the main hall would have been the heart of the home, quite literally. A fire kept burning for cooking, warmth, and light, since there was no other reliable source of illumination once the sun went down beyond a handful of oil lamps that burned expensive olive oil. Meals were simple by modern standards. Barley bread, olives, cheese made from goat or sheep milk, whatever fish had been caught that day, wine mixed generously with water because drinking it undiluted was considered excessive, even reckless. Meat was a special occasion food, usually tied to sacrifice or celebration, since animals were valuable alive, for milk, wool, and labor, and were not slaughtered casually. At night, the hall would fill with the low murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, the crackle of the fire settling as logs shifted. Someone might have a lyre, a small stringed instrument, and there is a good chance that on many evenings a traveling singer, someone we would now call a bard, might pass through and offer to perform in exchange for a meal and a place to sleep. These bards carried the news of the wider world in the form of songs and stories, tales of other kingdoms, other kings, other wars and marriages and disasters. It is worth sitting with the fact for a moment that this very story, the story of Odysseus, was likely first shared in exactly this way, sung aloud in halls like this one, passed from memory to memory for generations before anyone wrote it down. Let that settle in your mind for a moment. The oldest form of this story you are hearing tonight was never read. It was heard, the same way you are hearing it now. It is strange to think about how different daily awareness of the world was back then. There was no way to simply learn what was happening in a kingdom 3 days' sail away except through travelers, traders, and these wandering singers. News moved at the speed of a ship or a pair of walking feet. A war could be raging on the far side of the sea, and a farming family on a quiet island might not hear a whisper of it for weeks or months. That isolation is part of what makes the next part of the story so significant, because eventually, word did arrive on Ithaca of a growing crisis brewing across the sea, one that would eventually pull nearly every king in the Greek world, including a reluctant young Odysseus, into a war that would last a full decade. Let's continue. The marriage, the oath, and the call to war before we get to the war itself. There is a smaller, quieter story that explains a great deal about why so many kings ended up fighting in it, and it begins not with Odysseus, but with a woman named Helen, who lived in a kingdom called Sparta on the Greek mainland. Helen was, according to the old stories, extraordinarily beautiful, so much so that when it came time for her to marry, kings and princes from across the Greek world traveled to Sparta to ask for her hand. Imagine the scene for a moment. Dozens of powerful men, each with soldiers, ships, and pride, all gathered in one place, all wanting the same outcome, all fully capable of turning that disappointment into violence. Helen's stepfather, a king named Tyndarus, understood the danger immediately. Whoever he chose, the other suitors might feel humiliated enough to start a war right there in his own hall. It was Odysseus, still a young man at this point, who offered Tyndarus a clever solution, and it is one of the earliest hints in the old stories of the kind of mind he had. He suggested that every suitor swear a binding oath before the final decision was made. Each man would promise that whoever was chosen to marry Helen, all the others would defend that marriage if it was ever threatened. It was a way of turning potential rivals into future allies, bound together by their own word rather than by force. The suitors agreed, the oath was sworn, and Helen was given in marriage to a king named Menelaus, who ruled Sparta. In exchange for this idea, it is said that Tyndareus helped Odysseus in his own romantic pursuit, which had nothing to do with Helen at all. Odysseus had his eye on Helen's cousin, a quieter, more thoughtful woman named Penelope. Where Helen was famous for her beauty, Penelope was known even then for her intelligence and her steadiness, qualities that would matter enormously in the story still to come. The two were married, and Odysseus brought his new wife back across the sea to his rocky little island of Ithaca, where before long they had a son, a boy they named Telemachus. I want you to imagine that household in its earliest, quietest years. A young father, still learning to rule a small kingdom, a young mother running a household that included servants, weaving, storage of grain and oil, and the constant management of a farming and fishing economy. An infant son sleeping in a wooden cradle near the hearth. It is easy, when we only hear about heroes and monsters, to forget that these were also just families, trying to build ordinary lives in an often difficult world. That ordinary life did not last long. Years later, word reached Ithaca that Helen had left Sparta and gone to a city called Troy, on the coast of what is now Turkey, with a Trojan prince named Paris. Whether she went willingly or was taken by force is something the old sources genuinely disagree about, and honestly, we should sit with that uncertainty rather than smooth it over. Some versions of the story describe a passionate elopement. Others describe an abduction. What matters, historically speaking, is that Menelaus considered this a personal and political insult that could not be ignored, and he called upon every king who had sworn that old oath years earlier to help him bring Helen back, by force if necessary. This is where Odysseus's story takes its darkest early turn, because unlike many of the other kings, he did not want to go. He had a young wife, an infant son, and a kingdom he had only recently begun to settle into. War, even in an era that treated it as an ordinary part of political life, meant years away from home, real risk of death, and the strong possibility of never seeing your family again. According to some of the old traditions, when messengers arrived to bring Odysseus into the war, he tried something remarkably clever to avoid it. He pretended to have lost his mind, hitching an ox and a donkey together to the same plow, an absurd and useless pairing, and sowing his fields with salt instead of seed, as though he had become completely unfit to rule or fight. One of the men sent to recruit him, a king named Polyphemus, was suspicious of this sudden madness and decided to test it. He took Odysseus's infant son, Telemachus, and placed the baby directly in the path of the plow. Odysseus swerved instantly to avoid harming his child, proving in that single unthinking movement that his mind was perfectly intact. His trick had failed, and with real reluctance, he agreed to join the war effort, leaving his wife, his infant son, and his elderly father behind on Ithaca. I want you to picture that departure for a moment, because it is a scene that repeated itself in countless real households across the ancient world whenever a war was declared. A ship being loaded at the shore, bronze weapons wrapped and stowed, jars of wine and oil for the voyage, men embracing wives and children who had no real way of knowing if or when they would see each other again. There were no letters home in any reliable sense, no way to send word across the sea except through other travelers heading in the right direction. Once that ship pulled away from the shore, a family was, in a very real sense, cut off from any certain knowledge of their loved one's fate for as long as the separation lasted. For Penelope, that separation would last 20 years. Let's move to the war itself now, and to the 10 long years spent camped on a foreign shore, waiting for a city that refused to fall. The gathering at Aeolus before any of the Greek ships ever reached Troy. They first had to gather in one place, and the story of that gathering deserves a few quiet minutes of its own, because it shows us something about the scale and complexity of organizing a war among dozens of small, independent kingdoms that had no shared government, no standing combined army, and no real precedent for cooperating on this scale. The gathering point was a place called Aulis, a natural harbor on the Greek mainland where ships from across the Greek world slowly assembled over the course of many weeks, arriving from different islands and coastal kingdoms, each bringing their own soldiers, their own supplies, their own local customs and dialects, forming a coalition that was, by ancient standards, genuinely enormous. I want you to imagine that harbor slowly filling, week after week, with more and more ships pulling in, more and more temporary camps springing up along the shore, cooking fires multiplying across what had probably been, only a month earlier, a quiet stretch of coastline used mainly by local fishermen. Odysseus arrived among this growing coalition, one king among many, under the overall command of a powerful ruler named Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, whose brother Menelaus was the wronged husband whose cause had brought this entire alliance together in the first place. Coordinating an army made up of independent kings, each with his own soldiers loyal first to him and only secondarily to the larger coalition, each with his own pride and reputation to protect, must have been an exhausting, delicate political task in itself, well before a single arrow had been fired at Troy. The fleet was delayed at Aulis for a considerable time, according to the old stories, by unfavorable winds that refused to shift, trapping thousands of men and hundreds of ships in that one harbor for what felt like an unbearably long stretch of waiting. This is a detail worth sitting with, because it echoes something we will see again and again throughout Odysseus's own later journey home. This idea that wind, something so far beyond human control, could hold an entire army hostage indefinitely, turning powerful kings and soldiers into people who could do nothing but wait, day after day, for conditions to change. According to the darker versions of this tradition, Agamemnon was eventually told that the winds would only shift in the coalition's favor if he sacrificed his own daughter, Iphigenia, to appease an offended goddess. Different sources handle this story differently, some describing an actual horrifying sacrifice carried out at Aulis, others describing a last-minute substitution in which the girl was secretly saved and taken elsewhere, spared by divine intervention just as the blade was about to fall. Whichever version you find more believable, The story itself tells us something important about how differently this ancient culture understood the relationship between human beings and the gods they worshipped. A relationship built on the unsettling belief that divine favor could be bought, sometimes at an almost unbearable cost, and that even a powerful king was not exempt from being asked to pay it. Odysseus is mentioned in several versions of this story as having played a role in convincing Iphigenia and her mother to travel to Aulis in the first place, under the false pretense of a marriage rather than the truth of what actually awaited her there. A detail that, if true, sits uncomfortably alongside the more admirable cleverness he shows throughout the rest of the story. A reminder that even a hero remembered mostly for his wisdom and loyalty could be pulled into decisions that feel genuinely troubling by any standard, ancient or modern. Eventually, whatever the true cost, the winds did shift, and the enormous coalition fleet finally set sail from Aulis toward Troy, beginning the war that would occupy the next 10 years of Odysseus's life and set in motion everything that followed. I think it is worth carrying this story with you as we move forward into the war itself, a reminder that even the causes we tell ourselves are noble and justified often carry hidden costs and uncomfortable compromises buried somewhere beneath the surface. Costs that the old poets, to their credit, rarely tried to hide completely from their listeners. Let's move now to that shore outside Troy, where the fleet finally arrived after its long, difficult wait. 10 years under the walls of Troy, the war that followed is remembered today mostly through another great poem, the Iliad, which focuses on a single dramatic stretch near the end of the conflict. But I want to spend our time tonight on the parts of that decade that rarely get mentioned, the long, grinding, ordinary reality of what it actually meant for tens of thousands of men to camp outside a city for 10 years. Historically speaking, archaeologists have found real evidence of a city at the site traditionally identified as Troy, in northwestern Turkey, near the entrance to a narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. That location alone tells us something important. Whoever controlled Troy controlled trade and shipping through one of the most valuable water routes in the ancient world. Whatever role Helen's story played in the poetic tradition, the historical Trojan War, if there was a specific historical conflict behind these legends, almost certainly had a great deal to do with controlling that strait and the wealth that flowed through it. Imagine, for a moment, an army camp on that shore that has existed for years rather than weeks. Rows of ships pulled up onto the beach, some of them showing real wear from a decade of sitting exposed to salt air and weather. Tents and simple shelters built from whatever materials were available, since there was no way to construct anything permanent while under constant threat of raids. Cooking fires scattered across the camp every evening, the smell of roasting meat mixing with salt air and wood smoke. Thousands of men living in close quarters for years, developing their own routines, friendships, rivalries, and grief. This was not a constant, unbroken battle for 10 years. That would have been physically and logistically impossible. Instead, historians who study ancient warfare generally believe that sieges like this one involved long stretches of waiting, occasional raids on nearby towns for supplies, seasonal fighting when conditions allowed, and enormous amounts of simply enduring boredom, homesickness, and the slow wear of years away from ordinary life. Soldiers needed to eat, which meant supply lines had to be maintained, which meant raiding parties were sent out to nearby settlements to gather grain, livestock, and other goods. Since an army of this size camped in one place for a decade would have exhausted the local land almost immediately otherwise. Odysseus, according to the old stories, distinguished himself during this long war not primarily through raw physical strength, though he was certainly a capable fighter, but through his intelligence, his skill in negotiation, and his ability to read other people and situations. He served as an advisor to the Greek commanders, someone whose counsel was sought when brute force alone would not solve a problem. There are stories of him going on dangerous night missions into enemy territory to gather information, of talking down conflicts between quarreling Greek leaders whose pride threatened to fracture the entire alliance, of finding practical solutions when the war seemed to have reached an impossible stalemate. I want you to imagine one particular quiet evening in that camp, years into the siege, long after the initial excitement of going to war had worn away into something closer to grim endurance. A group of soldiers sits around a fire, mending sandals made of leather straps, sharpening bronze spearheads on stones, talking in low voices about home, about wives and children who were babies when they left and might now be nearly grown, about fields that were probably overgrown from years of neglect, about the strange, disorienting feeling of not knowing what your own life back home even looks like anymore. This is the texture of war that the dramatic poems rarely dwell on, the long, aching ordinariness of simply being away for so long that home itself starts to feel like a half-remembered dream. It was in roughly this 10th year, according to the tradition, that Odysseus devised the plan that would finally end the siege. One final piece of trickery that has become so famous it has entered our everyday language, even for people who know nothing else about ancient Greece. Let's continue and step inside the wooden horse. The wooden horse, by the 10th year of the siege, both sides were exhausted. The walls of Troy had held firm against a decade of assault, and the Greek forces, though still strong, had lost countless men to fighting, disease, and the sheer strain of prolonged war. It was Odysseus who proposed a plan that relied not on force, but on deception, a strategy that fit perfectly with the kind of mind he had shown throughout the entire war. The plan was this. The Greeks would build an enormous wooden horse, hollow inside, large enough to conceal a small group of armed men. The rest of the Greek army would then burn their camp and appear to sail away entirely, as though they had finally given up the siege after 10 fruitless years. They would leave the horse behind on the beach, along with a single Greek soldier whose job was to convince the Trojans that the horse was a genuine offering to the gods, one that the Trojans should bring inside their own walls. I want you to imagine the scene from the perspective of someone standing on the walls of Troy that morning. For 10 years, this person has looked out at a Greek camp stretching along the shoreline, ships pulled up onto the sand, smoke rising from 1,000 fires each evening. And then on this particular morning, all of that is simply gone. The ships have vanished from the horizon. The camp has been reduced to smoldering ash. After 10 years of grinding, exhausting siege, the war appears to be over, and the relief of that moment must have been almost impossible to describe. Standing alone on the empty beach is this enormous wooden horse, and a single Greek soldier, left behind, presenting himself as someone abandoned by his own people. According to the old stories, this soldier told a convincing tale, claiming that the horse had been built as an offering to the goddess Athena, deliberately made too large to fit through the gates of Troy, so that the Trojans would be forced to tear down part of their own wall to bring it inside, an act that would supposedly bring the favor of the gods down upon the city. There were voices of doubt within Troy. Some of the old stories describe a priest named Laestrygonian who warned his fellow citizens not to trust anything the Greeks had left behind, and a woman named Cassandra, a princess of Troy said to have the gift of true prophecy paired with the curse that no one would ever believe her, who also warned that the horse would bring the city's destruction. Neither warning was heeded. Whether out of genuine religious conviction, exhaustion after 10 years of siege, or simple wishful thinking, the people of Troy made the fateful decision to breach their own wall and drag the horse inside their city, then spent that evening celebrating what they believed was the end of the war, with wine, music, and the kind of relief that comes after an unbearably long ordeal has finally ended. That night, once the city had settled into celebration, and then into an exhausted sleep, the small group of Greek soldiers hidden inside the horse, Odysseus among them, quietly climbed down and opened the gates of the city from within. The Greek fleet, which had only pretended to sail away, returned under cover of darkness. What followed was the fall of Troy, a brutal, chaotic scene of a city being sacked after 10 years of holding out, an ending that the old poets did not shy away from describing in its full, grim reality, since ancient warfare rarely spared anyone once a city's walls had truly fallen. The war was over. Odysseus, along with the other surviving Greek kings, could finally begin the journey home. I want you to sit for a moment with what that must have felt like. 10 years is an enormous span of time to be away from your family, your home, your ordinary life. Odysseus had left as a young father with an infant son he barely knew. He was now heading home as a man who had spent a full decade at war, changed by all of it in ways both visible and invisible. And yet, as he and his men finally loaded their ships and turned their prows toward home, none of them had any idea that the journey back would end up taking almost as long as the war itself, and would test Odysseus in ways that no battlefield ever had. Let's follow that ship out to sea, and into the strange, dangerous waters that lay between Troy and home. Was there really a Troy before we sail out into open water with Odysseus? I want to take a short, quiet detour into a question that historians and archaeologists have argued over for well over a century now, because it adds a layer of real, grounded fascination to everything we have covered so far. Was there ever an actual historical war behind this story? And did an actual city called Troy ever really exist? For a long time, many educated people in the Western world assumed that Troy was purely legendary, a poetic invention with no more historical reality than the Cyclops or the Sirens. That assumption changed significantly in the 1870s, when a wealthy, self-taught German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann, deeply obsessed with the old Greek poems since childhood, began digging at a mound called Hisarlik, on the northwestern coast of what is now Turkey, a site some earlier scholars had already suggested might match the poem's description of Troy's location. What Schliemann found there was extraordinary. Not one city, but layer upon layer of successive settlements built one on top of another across thousands of years, each civilization building its new city directly on the ruins of the one before it, creating a mound that archaeologists still study carefully today. I want you to imagine the strange, careful work of excavating a site like that, digging down through layer after layer of human history, each level representing a different era, different pottery styles, different building techniques, different evidence of how people lived, ate, and eventually died or moved on. Schliemann's own methods, by modern archaeological standards, were actually quite rough and destructive, and later scholars have had to work carefully to correct some of the damage his hurried digging caused to more delicate layers of evidence. But his basic discovery held up under more careful, patient examination by later generations of archaeologists. This real place, matching the poem's general geography remarkably well, had indeed been the site of a significant, walled Bronze Age city. One particular layer at this site, which archaeologists label Troy VII, dates to roughly the correct period, somewhere around the 1200s before the Common Era, and shows genuine evidence of violent destruction, burned buildings, scattered human remains, and other signs consistent with a city that suffered a sudden, catastrophic attack rather than a gradual decline. This does not prove, in any definitive sense, that the specific war described in the old poems actually happened exactly as told, with gods intervening and a wooden horse and 10 years of siege. But it does suggest something quietly remarkable, that this story likely grew out of a real historical memory, a real city that really did fall to real violence around roughly the time the tradition claims it did. Its memory carried forward for centuries through oral storytelling, before finally being shaped into the poetic form we know today. It helps, too, to understand the wider historical context this destruction sits within. The period around 1100 years before the Common Era saw a widespread collapse of several major civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean, a poorly understood era that modern historians often call the Bronze Age collapse, affecting not just this region around Troy, but major kingdoms across Greece, the Middle East, and beyond. Trade networks broke down, several previously powerful cities were destroyed or abandoned, and written records, where they existed at all in this period, become noticeably sparse for generations afterward. Whatever specific conflict actually took place at Troy likely occurred somewhere within this larger period of widespread instability and upheaval, one destruction among many happening across an entire region during a genuinely difficult, poorly documented stretch of history. I find something quietly moving in this archaeological detective work. Honestly, the idea that underneath centuries of poetic embellishment, gods, monsters, and heroic speeches, there really might be a kernel of actual memory, an actual city, actual people who lived and worked and eventually died there, whose story was carried forward not through written records, which barely existed for ordinary events in this period, but through generations of oral poetry. slowly transformed and expanded until it became the epic we still read today. Whatever really happened at that windswept site on the Turkish coast 3,000 years ago, something about it clearly mattered enough to the people who survived it that they kept telling the story, generation after generation, until eventually someone wrote it down for good. With that grounding now in place, let's return to Odysseus and his fleet, sailing away from those very shores, whatever the true history behind them, and toward the long, strange journey that awaited them. The Cyclones and the Lotus Eaters, the journey home began with a mistake, one that set the tone for much of what followed. Sailing away from the ruins of Troy, Odysseus and his fleet of 12 ships stopped first at a place called Ismarus, home to a people called the Cyclones, who had been allies of Troy during the war. Rather than simply passing by, the men raided the town, a common enough practice among returning warriors of this era, who often supplemented their journey home with plunder taken along the way. They took food, wine, and other goods, and by most accounts, they should have loaded their ships and left immediately. Instead, they lingered on the shore, feasting on captured livestock and drinking captured wine well into the night, against Odysseus's own advice to move on quickly. I want you to imagine that scene, exhausted soldiers finally away from the grinding routine of a 10-year siege, suddenly presented with abundant food and wine on a foreign beach, the temptation to simply relax for one evening after so many years of hardship. It is a very human moment, even within a mythic story, this small, understandable lapse in discipline. That lapse cost them. The Cyclones who had fled inland returned by morning with reinforcements, and the fighting that followed was brutal, costing Odysseus several men from each of his 12 ships before the survivors managed to escape back to open water. It was a hard, sobering lesson delivered right at the start of the journey home, a reminder that the war might have ended at Troy, but danger had not ended with it. From there, the fleet was caught in a violent storm that blew them badly off course, far south of where they intended to sail, down toward the coast of North Africa, into unfamiliar waters where the normal landmarks that coastal sailors relied upon simply did not exist. This detail matters more than it might seem. Remember that sailors of this era navigated largely by sight, watching coastlines, familiar hills, and known landmarks to understand where they were. Being blown far off course into open, unfamiliar water was genuinely disorienting and dangerous, a situation that could easily end in a ship simply never finding its way home again. Eventually, the storm-battered fleet made landfall in a region the old stories call the land of the Lotus Eaters. Odysseus sent a small scouting party ashore to investigate, and this is where one of the strangest and quietest dangers of the entire journey unfolds. The people living there offered Odysseus's scouts a food made from the lotus plant, and the moment the men ate it, something changed in them. They lost all desire to return home. They wanted only to stay on that shore, eating the sweet lotus fruit, drifting through days that meant nothing and led nowhere, utterly content to forget their families, their king, their entire former lives. I want you to sit with how unsettling that particular danger is, especially compared to the monsters and storms still to come. There is no violence in it, no visible threat at all. It is simply the temptation of total, blissful forgetting, the pull toward giving up on the hard, uncertain work of finding your way home in favor of an easy, meaningless comfort that asks nothing of you. Odysseus, when he realized what had happened to his scouts, had to physically drag them back to the ships, weeping and struggling against him, and tie them beneath the rowing benches until the effects of the Lotus wore off enough for them to row without trying to escape back to shore. It is worth noticing, even this early in the journey, the shape of the story that is beginning to form. Every danger Odysseus and his men face is going to test something different, not just their physical strength, but their discipline, their patience, their ability to resist temptation, and above all, Odysseus's own particular gift for thinking his way through situations that brute force alone cannot solve. The next island they came to would test all of those qualities at once, in the cave of a creature unlike anything they had ever encountered. Let's go there now. The cave of the Cyclops. After leaving the land of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus's fleet came to an island inhabited by a race of enormous, one-eyed giants called the Cyclopes. These were not a civilized, city-building people in the way the Greeks understood civilization. According to the old descriptions, the Cyclopes had no laws, no assemblies, no shared agriculture. Each one lived alone in a cave, tending flocks of sheep and goats, answering to no one, a description that would have struck an ancient Greek audience as almost as strange and unsettling as the giant's single enormous eye, since a life lived entirely outside of community and shared law was, to the Greek mind, a kind of wildness bordering on the inhuman. Odysseus, driven by curiosity and the hope of finding hospitality, which was an extremely important cultural value in the ancient Greek world, took a small group of his men and a skin of particularly strong wine, and went to explore a large cave they found near the shore. This detail about hospitality is worth pausing on, because it explains a great deal of what happens next. In this era, the relationship between host and guest was considered sacred, protected by the gods themselves, particularly by Zeus. A traveler arriving at your home, even a stranger, was owed food, shelter, and safe passage, and in turn was expected to behave respectfully and eventually offer gifts or reciprocal hospitality. Odysseus, entering this cave, was operating under the assumption that this ancient code would apply, that whoever lived there would offer at least a basic welcome. The cave they found belonged to a Cyclops named Polyphemus, and it turned out to be filled with cheeses, milk, and pens of lambs and kids, clear signs of a shepherd's life lived in isolation. Odysseus's men urged him to simply take some of the food and leave before the owner returned, a practical, cautious suggestion that, in hindsight, would have saved a great deal of suffering. Odysseus refused, wanting to see this giant for himself and to test whether the old rules of hospitality would be honored. When Polyphemus returned that evening, driving his flocks into the cave and sealing the entrance with an enormous boulder that no group of ordinary men could possibly move, it became immediately clear that hospitality was not on his mind at all. Upon discovering the Greeks hiding inside his home, he responded not with welcome, but by seizing two of Odysseus's men and eating them raw, right in front of the others, before settling in to sleep for the night, fully satisfied, while the surviving Greeks were trapped inside the sealed cave with no way to escape. I want you to imagine the horror and the helplessness of that night. Trapped in darkness with a monster capable of casually killing and eating a man, sealed behind a boulder too heavy to move, with no weapon that could plausibly kill a creature of that size without alerting it, and getting everyone slaughtered before the deed was finished. This is exactly the kind of impossible situation where physical strength alone offers no solution, and it is exactly the kind of situation where Odysseus's mind became the only real weapon available to him. Over the following day, while Polyphemus was out grazing his flocks, Odysseus and his remaining men sharpened a large wooden stake from an olive branch they found in the cave, hardening the point in the fire, then hiding it. That evening, when Polyphemus returned and ate 2 more of the men, Odysseus offered him the strong wine he had brought along, wine so potent it needed to be heavily diluted with water under normal circumstances. Polyphemus, unfamiliar with wine of this strength and delighted by it, drank cup after cup, growing increasingly drunk and sentimental. In a moment that has become one of the most famous pieces of wordplay in all of ancient storytelling, Polyphemus asked Odysseus his name, and Odysseus answered that his name was Nobody. Satisfied and thoroughly drunk, Polyphemus told Odysseus that as a reward for the excellent wine, he would eat him last, then promptly fell into a deep, drunken sleep. This was the moment Odysseus and his men had been waiting for. They took the hardened wooden stake, heated it once more in the embers of the fire until the tip glowed, and drove it directly into Polyphemus's single eye, blinding him instantly. The giant's screams of agony brought the other Cyclops living on nearby parts of the island rushing to his cave, calling out to ask what was wrong, who was hurting him. Polyphemus, still in agony, shouted back that nobody was hurting him, that nobody was trying to kill him. Hearing this, the other Cyclops, quite reasonably, assumed that if nobody was attacking him, there was no real emergency, and they returned to their own homes, leaving Polyphemus alone with his enemies. The final piece of this escape is, in its own way, one of the most elegant solutions in the entire story. Blind but not stupid, Polyphemus rolled the boulder away from the cave entrance just enough to let his sheep out to graze the next morning, running his hands along the back of each animal as it passed, expecting the Greeks to try to slip out among the flock and hoping to catch them by touch. Odysseus, anticipating exactly this, had his men tie themselves to the undersides of the largest rams, 3 animals bound together beneath each man, so that Polyphemus's searching hands only ever felt the backs of ordinary sheep passing by, never realizing that his enemies were escaping directly underneath his fingers. Once safely back at their ships, Odysseus made one final mistake, driven by pride rather than necessity. As the ships pulled away from the island, he shouted back to the blinded giant, revealing his true name and mocking him for having been outsmarted. It felt, in that moment, like a well-earned victory lap after such a harrowing escape. But Polyphemus was the son of the sea god Poseidon, and hearing Odysseus's real name, he called out to his father, praying that Odysseus would suffer greatly before ever reaching home again, that he would lose all his men and arrive at last as a broken, friendless stranger in a stranger's ship. That single moment of pride, that need to be recognized and remembered rather than simply escaping quietly, is often pointed to as the true beginning of Odysseus's long suffering at sea. Poseidon heard his son's prayer, and from that point forward, the god of the sea became a genuine obstacle standing between Odysseus and his home, delaying and tormenting him at nearly every turn for years to come. I want you to sit with that idea for a moment before we move on, because it says something quietly true about human nature that has not changed in 3,000 years. The instinct to want credit, to want the person who wronged you to know exactly who defeated them, is a very old and very human impulse. And yet, so often, that same impulse is what turns a clean victory into a long, painful consequence. Let's continue on into the winds of Aeolus and the bag that should never have been opened. The bag of winds and the Laestrygonians, after escaping Polyphemus's island, Odysseus and his surviving fleet came to a floating island ruled by a figure named Aeolus, who the old stories describe as the keeper of the winds, a role that fit neatly with how the ancient Greeks tried to make sense of one of the most unpredictable forces in their entire world. Sailors of this era lived and died by the wind, and having no scientific understanding of weather systems, it made a certain intuitive sense to imagine all the winds of the world as living forces, kept somewhere, controlled by someone. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus and his men with genuine hospitality, hosting them for an entire month, and when it came time for them to leave, he gave Odysseus a remarkable gift, a leather bag in which he had trapped every unfavorable wind in the world, leaving only a single gentle west wind free to blow Odysseus's ship steadily and safely all the way home. It was, in effect, a guaranteed safe passage, an extraordinary act of generosity from a god-like figure who understood exactly how dangerous the sea could be for ordinary sailors. For 9 days, this worked exactly as promised. The ship sailed smoothly, steadily, closer and closer to Ithaca, so close that on the 10th day, Odysseus could actually see smoke rising from fires on his own island in the distance. I want you to imagine what that moment must have felt like, after 10 years of war and months of dangerous, exhausting travel, catching your first real glimpse of home, close enough to see the smoke from your own hearths rising into the sky. It must have felt, for just a moment, like the entire ordeal was finally, mercifully coming to an end. Odysseus, utterly exhausted from personally steering the ship for 9 straight days without rest, finally allowed himself to sleep, believing the journey's hardest parts were behind him. And it was in this exact moment of vulnerability that his own crew undid everything. Some of the men, watching Odysseus carefully guard that leather bag throughout the entire voyage, had convinced themselves it must contain treasure, gold or silver given to their captain by Aeolus that he was refusing to share. While Odysseus slept, they opened the bag. The trapped winds burst out all at once, a violent, chaotic storm that blew the fleet backward across the entire distance they had just traveled, all the way back to Aeolus's floating island, undoing 9 full days of progress in what must have felt like a matter of hours. When Odysseus woke to find his ship being torn apart by the very winds meant to guarantee his safe return home, and realized what his own men had done out of simple, misplaced suspicion and greed, it must have been one of the most devastating moments of the entire journey, closer than at any other point to actually reaching home, only to lose it all through no fault of the gods at all, but through ordinary human distrust among his own crew. When they returned to Aeolus's island and Odysseus explained what had happened, the god's response was cold and final. He refused to help a second time, telling Odysseus that a man so clearly hated by the gods was not someone he wished to assist any further, and sent them away with no winds, favorable or otherwise, forced now to row by their own strength alone, back into the same dangerous, uncertain waters they had only just escaped. From there, exhausted and demoralized, the fleet came upon the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of giants even more immediately dangerous than the Cyclops had been. Odysseus, having learned at least some caution from his earlier mistakes, kept his own ship anchored outside the harbor while sending a small scouting party ahead to investigate. What they found was a harbor that looked deceptively safe, tall cliffs on either side creating perfectly still water, an appealing shelter after so much rough sea. But the scouts who ventured further inland to seek out the local ruler found instead a horrifying scene: the giant queen of the Laestrygonians, and shortly after, her husband, who immediately seized one of the scouts and began preparing him as a meal. The scouts fled back toward the harbor, but the Laestrygonians were faster and far more numerous than anyone had anticipated, hurling massive boulders down from the cliffs onto the ships trapped in that narrow harbor below, smashing hull after hull, then wading into the water themselves to spear the drowning, helpless sailors like fish. Of Odysseus's original 12 ships, all but his own single vessel were destroyed in this attack, an almost unbearable loss delivered in a matter of terrifying minutes. Only Odysseus's own ship, which he had wisely kept anchored just outside the harbor rather than sailing all the way in, managed to escape. I want you to imagine sailing away from that scene, looking back at a harbor now littered with the wreckage of 11 ships, knowing that hundreds of men who had survived a decade of war at Troy had just been killed within moments, through nothing more than bad luck in choosing which harbor to shelter in. This is the point in the journey where the story stops being an adventure in any exciting sense and becomes something heavier, a story about grief, about diminishing hope, about a man watching almost everyone he set sail with disappear one disaster at a time. With only a single ship and its crew remaining, Odysseus continued on, and the next island they found belonged to a powerful sorceress whose name has become nearly as famous as Odysseus's own. Let's go there now, to the island of Circe. The island of Circe. The island belonged to a powerful sorceress named Circe, who lived alone in a grand stone house set in a clearing deep within the island's forest, surrounded, strangely, by wolves and mountain lions that showed no aggression toward visitors at all, moving instead with an eerie, unnatural gentleness, wagging and nuzzling like household dogs rather than wild predators. This detail alone should have warned Odysseus's men that something deeply unnatural was at work on this island, since wild animals behaving this way toward strangers was not a good sign in any world, ancient or modern. Odysseus split his remaining crew into 2 groups to explore the island, and the group led by a man named Eurylochus discovered Circe's house, from which drifted the sound of a woman singing beautifully while working at a large loom, an image that must have seemed comforting and civilized after the horrors of the Laestrygonian harbor. Circe invited the men inside, offered them a meal and wine, and welcomed them with every appearance of genuine hospitality. But hidden in that food was a drug that stripped away each man's memory of who they were, and once they had eaten it, Circe struck each of them with her wand, transforming them instantly into pigs, though their human minds remained trapped and fully aware inside their new animal bodies. I want you to imagine the particular horror of that curse, retaining every memory, every fear, every awareness of your own transformation, while being physically reduced to an animal, herded now into a pen alongside other transformed men, unable even to speak and explain what had happened to you. Eurylochus, who had stayed outside the house out of caution rather than following the others inside, witnessed enough of this to understand something had gone terribly wrong, and ran back to warn Odysseus. Odysseus, despite Eurylochus's pleading not to go anywhere near that house, set out alone to rescue his men, understanding that leaving them transformed like this was simply not an option he was willing to accept. On his way through the forest, Odysseus encountered a young figure who revealed himself as the god Hermes, messenger of the gods, who gave Odysseus both a warning about what awaited him and a gift to help him survive it. Hermes provided Odysseus with a plant called moly, which the old stories describe as having a black root and a white flower, a plant so rare it was said to be difficult even for the gods to find, and explained that it would protect Odysseus from Circe's magic entirely. This is one of the few moments in the entire journey where a god intervenes directly to help Odysseus rather than hinder him, and it is worth noting that even this help came with a clear expectation attached, since Hermes also instructed Odysseus in exactly how to handle the confrontation that was about to unfold. Protected by the moly, Odysseus ate the food Circe offered without transforming, and when she struck him with her wand expecting the usual result, nothing happened. Following Hermes's guidance, Odysseus then drew his sword and threatened Circe directly, and the sorceress, recognizing that only one man in the world could possibly resist her magic like this, immediately understood who she was dealing with, since prophecy had apparently already told her that a man named Odysseus would one day arrive on her island. Rather than continuing to fight him, Circe invited him to bed instead, a common enough pattern in these old stories, where confrontation between a mortal hero and a powerful, magical figure often resolves not through further violence but through an alliance, sometimes romantic, sometimes simply diplomatic. Odysseus, cautious even in this moment of apparent victory, made her swear a solemn oath not to harm him or his men before agreeing to anything further, a small but telling detail that shows just how deeply his 10 years of war and months of disaster at sea had taught him never to trust a peaceful resolution without securing it first. Once Circe swore this oath, she restored his transformed men to their human forms, and in fact, the old stories describe them emerging even more handsome and youthful than they had been before their transformation, as though the entire ordeal had somehow been undone completely. What followed was an entire year of rest on Circe's island, an extended stay that the old stories treat with surprising gentleness, given everything that came before and after it. After the relentless string of disasters that had claimed 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships and hundreds of his men, this year represents something the crew desperately needed: actual rest, actual safety, actual time to simply exist without immediate threat of death. Circe hosted them generously throughout this year, and it is easy to imagine the strange, quiet routine that must have settled over the group, feasting each evening, recovering physically and mentally from trauma that would be difficult for anyone to process, slowly regaining some sense of normalcy after so much loss. Eventually, it was Odysseus's own men who reminded him that a year had passed, and it was time to think again of home, a detail worth noticing because it shows the crew, even after everything, had not given up on the idea of eventually returning to their families. When Odysseus asked Circe for the chance to finally continue his journey home, she agreed to help him, but the help she offered was unlike anything he had faced so far. Before he could safely continue his journey, she told him he needed to travel to the edge of the world itself and speak with the dead. Let's follow him there now, into the underworld, to seek guidance from a prophet who had been dead for years. The journey to the underworld, Circe's instructions were strange and specific. Odysseus was to sail to the far edge of the world, to a place of perpetual mist and darkness where the sun never properly reached, near the boundary between the world of the living and the underworld itself. There, he was to dig a small pit, pour offerings of milk, honey, wine, water, and barley into it, and sacrifice a black ram and a black ewe, letting their blood pool into the pit. This blood, Circe explained, would draw the spirits of the dead, who craved even a small taste of the vitality they had lost. And among these gathering spirits, Odysseus would be able to speak briefly with the ghost of a blind prophet named Tiresias, who alone among the dead retained his full mind and the gift of true prophecy, even beyond death. I want you to imagine the strangeness of this scene, standing at the edge of a mist-shrouded, sunless shore, digging a small pit into unfamiliar earth, and watching it slowly fill with ghosts. According to the old descriptions, spirits came from every direction once the blood was offered: young women who had died before marriage, old men worn down by long lives, soldiers still bearing the wounds that killed them, all of them drawn by the promise of blood, all of them desperate for even a brief moment of contact with something resembling life again. Odysseus, following Circe's careful instructions, kept them back with his sword, allowing only Tiresias to approach and drink first. Tiresias's prophecy for Odysseus was sobering rather than comforting. He confirmed that Odysseus would indeed make it home eventually, but warned him of specific dangers still ahead, particularly a warning about cattle belonging to the sun god Helios that Odysseus and his men would encounter on an island later in their journey. If his men harmed those sacred cattle in any way, Tiresias warned, they would face utter destruction, and even if Odysseus himself survived, he would return home alone, having lost every single one of his remaining companions, arriving at last on a stranger's ship with nothing left of the fleet or the men who had sailed with him from Troy. Even once he reached home, Tiresias explained, Odysseus would find his household overrun by arrogant men competing for his wife's hand in marriage, believing him dead, and would need to deal with them through violence before he could reclaim his own life and kingdom. And even after that, Tiresias told him, more journeying still awaited him, a final task involving carrying an oar so far inland that he would eventually meet people who had never seen the sea and did not even recognize what he was carrying, where he would need to make one final peace offering to the sea god Poseidon before he could finally live out the rest of his life in genuine peace. I want you to sit for a moment with how heavy that prophecy must have felt to hear, especially this far into an already exhausting journey. Odysseus was not simply told that everything would work out. He was told, with real specificity, that more suffering, more loss, and more violence lay ahead of him before any real peace was possible. And yet he chose to continue anyway, which tells you something important about the kind of endurance this entire story is actually built around. This was never really a story about luck or ease. It was always a story about a man who kept moving forward, piece by piece, decision by decision, even when he knew in advance exactly how much more it was going to cost him. Before leaving that misty shore, Odysseus also encountered the spirit of his own mother, Anticlea, who he had not even known had died while he was away at war and wandering the seas. When he tried 3 times to embrace her, his arms passed through her each time, since she was nothing but a ghost, insubstantial as smoke, and this small, quiet moment of grief, a son unable to hold his own mother even for a final farewell, sits in stark contrast to the monsters and magic surrounding it. It is one of the most human moments in the entire journey, a reminder that behind every mythic adventure in this story, there is an ordinary, aching grief running underneath it, the accumulated cost of 10 years away from a life and a family that kept moving forward without him. He also spoke briefly with the spirits of several fallen heroes from the Trojan War, including a great warrior named Achilles, whose ghost delivered one of the most quietly devastating lines in the entire tradition, telling Odysseus that he would rather be a poor laborer serving another man on earth, working the hardest, most thankless job imaginable, than be a king ruling over all the dead in the underworld. It is a strange and moving thought to sit with, coming from a warrior whose glory in life had been so absolute. This idea that even the most celebrated victory or fame means nothing at all once weighed against the simple, ordinary experience of merely being alive. With Tiresias's warnings now weighing on him, Odysseus returned to his ship and continued the journey home, back toward Circe's island briefly to bury a crew member who had died accidentally during their stay, and then onward, toward waters that held 2 of the most famous dangers in the entire story, one built entirely around temptation, and the other built around an impossible, no-win choice between 2 horrors. Let's continue on, toward the Song of the Sirens. The Sirens, and Scylla and Charybdis returning briefly to Circe's island to bury their fallen companion, Odysseus received one final round of guidance from the sorceress, detailed warnings about the specific dangers that still lay directly in their path, information that would prove essential for surviving what came next. The first of these dangers involved creatures called the Sirens, beings usually described in the oldest traditions not as beautiful women in water, which is how later art often imagined them, but as strange bird-bodied creatures with women's faces, perched on a rocky island surrounded by the bleached bones and rotting remains of countless sailors who had come before. Their danger was not physical strength or monstrous size. Their danger was their voice. The sirens sang with a beauty so overwhelming that any sailor who heard it lost all will to do anything except steer toward them, so completely entranced that they would sail directly onto the rocks surrounding the island and die there, shipwrecked, having never even wanted to look away. Circe had told Odysseus exactly how to survive this passage, and the solution he chose reveals something interesting about his character, because rather than simply avoiding the danger altogether, Odysseus wanted to actually hear the song and survive it, a choice driven by curiosity that had gotten him into serious trouble before, with Polyphemus, and would define much of the rest of his life as well. Following Circe's instructions, he had his men plug their own ears completely with softened beeswax, so that they would hear nothing at all as they rowed past the island, while Odysseus himself, wanting to hear the legendary song, had his men bind him tightly to the ship's mast, with strict instructions that no matter how desperately he begged or ordered them to release him once the song began, they were to ignore him completely and only tighten the ropes further if needed. I want you to imagine that scene, the ship gliding past a rocky island in dead silence for the rowing crew, their ears sealed against a beauty they would never know they missed, while their captain, bound helplessly to the mast, experienced something so overwhelming that by his own account afterward, he begged and struggled with everything he had, desperate to break free and steer toward the voices calling his name with promises of knowledge and beauty beyond anything else in the world. The men, following their orders exactly, rowed on without wavering, and once they had passed safely beyond the range of the sirens' voices, they untied their captain, who returned slowly to himself, shaken by an experience unlike anything else in his long journey, a danger that had asked nothing of his strength or cunning, only his ability to survive wanting something so completely that it would have killed him. The very next danger offered no such clever workaround at all, only an impossible choice. Circe had warned Odysseus about a narrow strait guarded on either side by two monstrous forces. On one side lived Scylla, a six-headed monster lodged permanently in a high cliff cave, each head capable of snatching a sailor directly off the deck of a passing ship, guaranteed to kill exactly 6 men with each pass, no more, no less. On the opposite side of the strait lurked Charybdis, a massive whirlpool that swallowed the sea itself 3 times a day, capable of pulling an entire ship and everyone aboard down into its depths if you sailed too close. Circe's advice was blunt and difficult to hear. There was no way to defeat either monster, and no way to avoid the strait entirely. The only real choice was which side to sail closer to, and she told Odysseus plainly that it was far better to lose 6 men to Scylla than to risk losing the entire ship and every single man aboard to Charybdis. This is, I think, one of the most quietly brutal moments in the entire story, a leader being told in advance with complete certainty that a small number of his own men were simply going to die, and that his only real job was to choose which men, and to make sure the rest of the crew survived. I want you to imagine being the captain in that moment, steering deliberately closer to the cliff you know holds a monster that will kill 6 of your own crew, watching helplessly as Scylla's heads shoot down and sees 6 struggling men right off the deck, their cries calling out to you even as you continue rowing forward, unable to stop, unable to help, because stopping or turning back would mean losing everyone rather than just those 6. Odysseus later described this moment as the most painful thing he witnessed in his entire journey, watching men he had commanded for years be taken and killed right in front of him, while he did nothing except keep the ship moving forward, because moving forward was the only thing that could save everyone else. It is a moment that captures something true about leadership and survival that rarely makes it into the more triumphant tellings of this story. Sometimes the wisest, most necessary choice is still a devastating one. Sometimes surviving simply means choosing the smaller tragedy over the larger one, and living the rest of your life with the weight of that choice. Having survived Scylla and Charybdis, though badly shaken and grieving 6 more lost companions, Odysseus and his remaining crew came at last to the island Tiresias had specifically warned him about, an island where cattle belonging to the sun god Helios grazed peacefully, and where the fate of the entire remaining crew would ultimately be decided. Let's go there next. The cattle of the sun, the island belonged to Helios, the sun god, and it was home to his sacred herds of cattle and sheep, animals that never bred, never died naturally, and never diminished in number, tended by 2 of the god's own daughters. Odysseus, remembering both Circe's warning and Tiresias's specific prophecy about this exact place, was deeply reluctant to land there at all, and only agreed to stop when his exhausted, grieving crew begged him for a chance to simply rest on solid ground after the horror of losing 6 men to Scylla only days before. Before they landed, Odysseus made his men swear a solemn oath not to touch any of the cattle or sheep on the island, explaining clearly why this mattered so much and what Tiresias had warned would happen if they disobeyed. His crew agreed, and for a time they kept that promise, living off the food supplies Circe had given them before their departure, resting on the shore, waiting for favorable winds to continue their journey. But the winds did not cooperate. Storm after storm kept the ship trapped on that island for an entire month, and slowly, their food supplies dwindled down to nothing, forcing the men into increasingly desperate hunting and fishing along the shore just to survive, catching whatever birds and fish they could find, never enough to properly feed everyone. I want you to imagine that stretch of weeks, trapped on an island with an oath hanging over you and an ever-growing hunger gnawing at your body, surrounded by fat, healthy cattle grazing peacefully just beyond your camp, animals that would provide more meat than the entire crew could eat in a week, animals you have sworn, under threat of complete destruction, never to touch. Eventually, while Odysseus was away from the camp praying to the gods for guidance, exhausted hunger overcame the crew's discipline. Led by Eurylochus, the same man who had warned Odysseus about Circe's house earlier in the journey, the men argued that a quick death from angry gods was preferable to a slow, agonizing death from starvation, and that if they were going to die anyway, they might as well die with full stomachs. They killed several of the sacred cattle, roasted the meat, and offered a portion to the gods as a gesture of appeasement, hoping that gesture might somehow soften the consequences of what they had just done. When Odysseus returned and discovered what had happened, it was already too late to undo it. He could only watch in dread as the following days revealed unmistakable, uncanny signs of the gods' anger. The skins of the slaughtered cattle beginning to crawl along the ground on their own, and the meat on the spits bellowing like a living animal even as it cooked, horrifying supernatural signs confirming that a genuine transgression against the gods had occurred, one that could not simply be apologized away. For 6 more days, the crew continued eating the meat regardless, since there was little else to do once the deed was done. And then, finally, the winds shifted favorably, and they set sail once more, believing perhaps that they had escaped the worst of the consequences. They had not. Once they were out in open water, far from any land, Zeus sent a violent storm that destroyed the ship completely, splitting the mast and hull apart, and every single member of the crew still remaining, every man who had sailed with Odysseus this far, from Troy through Cicons and Lotus eaters, and the Cyclops and Circe and the Underworld and Scylla, every one of them drowned in that storm, exactly as Tiresias had warned so long before. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to broken pieces of his own destroyed ship, lashing the mast and keel together into a small makeshift raft, drifting alone now in open water with absolutely nothing left of the fleet he had commanded since leaving the shores of Troy. I want you to sit with the full weight of that moment, because it is, in many ways, the loneliest and most devastating point in the entire journey. Every companion who had shared in the war, the storms, the monsters, and the losses along the way was now gone, and Odysseus, the man whose cleverness had saved them from disaster after disaster, had been utterly unable to save them from this final, fatal mistake, one that was not even his own choice, but a consequence of hunger and desperation among men he could not fully control. Drifting alone on that makeshift raft, Odysseus was eventually swept back past the very strait guarding Scylla and Charybdis, and in a final piece of desperate survival, managed to avoid both monsters by clinging to an overhanging fig tree above the whirlpool, waiting patiently for hours until his broken raft was spat back out by Charybdis, then dropping down to retrieve it and continuing on, alone, exhausted, and grieving, with no ship, no crew, and no clear sense of how much farther home might still be. It was in this state, broken and utterly alone after so many years of war and disaster, that Odysseus finally washed ashore on the island of a goddess named Calypso, where he would remain for 7 long years, in a strange, complicated kind of captivity disguised as paradise. Let's go there now. 7 years with Calypso. Calypso was a nymph, a minor goddess associated with a small, isolated island called Ogygia, so remote that it existed at the very edge of the known world, far from any trade routes or other inhabited land. When Odysseus washed ashore there, exhausted and half-drowned after the destruction of his final ship, Calypso took him in, cared for him, and eventually fell deeply in love with him, offering him a life of extraordinary comfort in exchange for staying with her permanently on her island. I want you to pause here and really consider the strangeness of this situation, because on the surface, it might sound almost like a happy ending after so much suffering. Calypso's home was, by every description, a place of genuine paradise, lush and fertile, filled with fragrant cedar and juniper wood burning constantly in her hearth, sending sweet-smelling smoke drifting across the entire island, surrounded by soft meadows of violets and wild celery, 4 fresh springs running near her cave, grapevines heavy with fruit. She offered Odysseus not only physical comfort but something even more extraordinary, immortality itself, the chance to remain forever youthful, forever safe, forever free of the aging and death that awaited every ordinary mortal. And yet, according to the old stories, Odysseus spent much of those 7 years sitting alone on the rocky shore of that beautiful island, staring out across the water toward home, weeping. This detail matters enormously because it tells us something the story wants us to understand clearly. Comfort alone, even paradise itself, even the offer of eternal life, was not enough to satisfy him if it meant permanent separation from his actual home, his actual wife, his actual son, who by this point had grown from an infant into a young man Odysseus had never really known. This is, in many ways, one of the most quietly profound ideas in the entire Odyssey, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, especially at this hour in the quiet of your own evening. The story could have ended here, with a hero settling comfortably into an easy, painless eternity on a beautiful island with a goddess who loved him. Instead, the story insists that home, ordinary mortal home, with all its uncertainty and aging and eventual death, mattered more to Odysseus than paradise itself. It is a strange and moving statement about what human beings actually value, once you strip away the fantasy of easy comfort and ask what a person truly wants. For 7 years, Calypso kept him there, whether through genuine hope that he would eventually choose to stay willingly, or through a kind of possessive reluctance to let him go. The old stories leave somewhat ambiguous, though several versions describe her quite directly refusing his repeated requests to build a raft and leave. It was only when the goddess Athena, who had favored Odysseus throughout much of the war and his journey, finally convinced Zeus to intervene directly, that Calypso received an order she could not refuse. A message delivered by Hermes instructing her to release Odysseus and help him build a proper raft to finally continue his journey home. According to the old descriptions, Calypso was genuinely heartbroken by this order, and there is a particularly moving exchange in the old poem where she points out, with real bitterness, that the gods seem to have no objection when male gods take mortal women as companions, yet object strongly the moment a goddess wishes to keep a mortal man by her side. A small but pointed observation about the unequal standards the gods themselves seem to apply to their own behavior. Still, she honored Zeus's command, helping Odysseus build a sturdy raft, providing him with supplies, clothing, and a favorable wind. And finally, after 7 long years on that isolated island, Odysseus set sail once more, alone toward home. But Poseidon, still furious over the blinding of his son Polyphemus so many years earlier, noticed Odysseus's raft crossing the open sea and raised one final devastating storm against him, tearing the raft apart entirely and leaving Odysseus struggling in violent, churning water, exhausted after 7 years of relative inactivity, fighting simply to keep his head above the waves. It was only through the intervention of a minor sea goddess named Ino, who took pity on him and gave him a magical veil to keep him afloat, combined with Athena's continued quiet guidance, that Odysseus survived 2 full days and nights adrift in open water before finally washing ashore, naked, exhausted, and utterly alone, on the coast of a land called Scheria, home to a seafaring people known as the Phaeacians. Let's follow him onto that beach now, and into one of the gentler, more hopeful chapters of his entire long journey. The Phaeacians Odysseus washed up on the shore of Scheria in an utterly wretched state, covered in dried salt, his skin cracked and swollen from 2 days in the sea, so completely exhausted that he crawled beneath a pair of olive bushes growing close together, covered himself with a pile of fallen leaves for warmth, and simply collapsed into a deep sleep, with no idea whatsoever what land he had washed up on or who might find him there. The next morning, a young princess named Nausicaa came to that same stretch of shore with her attendants to wash clothing in a nearby stream, an entirely ordinary domestic task that, in this era, required actually traveling to a source of fresh water with a cart, since large-scale laundering was not something done casually at home. I want you to imagine that scene for a moment. A group of young women laughing and talking as they worked, spreading freshly washed clothing out on the rocks and sand to dry in the sun, then playing a game with a ball to pass the time while the clothes dried. Ordinary young women enjoying an ordinary morning by the sea, entirely unaware of the shipwrecked, exhausted stranger sleeping just beyond the bushes nearby. Their ball, thrown a bit too enthusiastically, landed in the water, and the shriek of laughter that followed woke Odysseus from his exhausted sleep. Naked, covered in dried salt and sand, and painfully aware of how frightening he must have looked after everything he had endured, he emerged from the bushes, and rather than terrifying the young women, which most of them understandably did flee from at the sight of him, Odysseus displayed exactly the kind of careful, practiced diplomacy that had served him throughout the entire war and journey. He addressed Nausicaa directly, with remarkable tact and respect, comparing her beauty to a young palm tree he had once seen growing near a sacred site, and asking humbly for basic help, clothing, direction, and perhaps a place to wash himself before approaching her father's city. Nausicaa, impressed by his careful, respectful manner despite his wretched physical condition, provided him with clothing, food, and directions to her father's palace, and even arranged for her own attendants to help guide him safely into the city, since Phaeacian custom held that a stranger's fate rested heavily on how well they were welcomed. This entire encounter is worth pausing on, because it shows Odysseus at what might be his most quietly skillful, using nothing but careful words and genuine humility to turn a potentially disastrous, humiliating first encounter into the beginning of genuine hospitality and support. Once inside the palace of King Alcinous, Odysseus was welcomed as an honored guest, given a proper bath, fresh clothing, and a place of honor at a lavish feast, all before anyone even asked him his actual name or the details of what had happened to him. This, too, reflects something important about the ancient Greek understanding of hospitality that we touched on earlier with Polyphemus. This idea that a guest deserved care and welcome first, with questions about identity and purpose only coming later, once basic human needs had already been properly met. It was at this feast, moved to tears by a bard singing songs about the Trojan War, songs about events Odysseus himself had lived through and men he had personally known and lost, that Odysseus finally revealed who he truly was. And it was here, surrounded by attentive, sympathetic hosts, that Odysseus told the entire extraordinary story of everything that had happened to him since leaving Troy, the very story we have been following together tonight. The Cicons and the Lotus eaters, Polyphemus and the winds of Aeolus, the Laestrygonians and Circe, the Underworld and the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the cattle of the sun, and finally his 7 long years on Calypso's island. This is, quite elegantly, the actual structure the ancient poem itself uses. Most of these adventures presented as Odysseus's own spoken account, told aloud around a feast, rather than narrated directly by the poet from the very beginning. Moved by his story and impressed by the man himself, King Alcinous and his people provided Odysseus with a proper ship and crew of their own skilled sailors, loaded with generous parting gifts of bronze, gold, and fine woven cloth. And finally, after so many years of war and disaster and wandering, sent him on the final leg of his journey home to Ithaca. There is something quietly moving in this final act of hospitality, an entire kingdom of strangers, moved by one man's suffering and his careful, humble telling of it, choosing to give him everything he needed to finally complete a journey that had cost him absolutely everything else. It stands in such deliberate contrast to Polyphemus's cave, to the Laestrygonians' harbor, to so many of the earlier, more dangerous encounters in this story. A reminder that hospitality, real hospitality, freely given without expectation of anything in return, was considered one of the very highest values in this entire ancient world, and its presence or absence often decided whether an encounter in this story ended in disaster or in genuine kindness. Let's follow that Phaeacian ship now, as it finally, at long last, carries Odysseus home to the shores of Ithaca. Life on Ithaca during the long wait before we follow Odysseus back onto his own shore. I want to spend a little more time imagining what daily life had actually become on Ithaca during those 20 years. Because so much of this story is really about the people who waited, not just the man who wandered, and their experience deserves the same careful attention we have given to storms and monsters. Imagine Penelope's morning routine during these years, something that would have looked, on the surface, almost identical to any other noblewoman's household in this era, and yet was quietly reshaped by the strange, uncomfortable presence of more than 100 uninvited men living under her roof. She would have risen before full daylight, as most people in this world did, dressing in a simple woven tunic, her hair bound back, moving through a household that technically still belonged to her and her absent husband, but that had, in practical terms, been overtaken by guests who refused to leave and refused to be told no. Her days would have been filled with the ordinary management any noble household required, overseeing servants preparing meals, checking on stores of grain and oil that were being consumed at an alarming, unsustainable rate by the suitors' constant feasting, managing the wool and flax that would eventually become clothing and bedding for the household. And then, each evening, there was the shroud, that quiet, private act of resistance she performed for years, weaving during the day where the suitors could see her working diligently toward the goal they wanted, then secretly unpicking the threads by lamplight once the household had gone quiet for the night, her fingers moving through work she knew would need to be undone again the very next day. An exhausting, repetitive labor undertaken entirely in secret, sustained by nothing but her own stubborn hope and loyalty. I want you to imagine the particular psychological toll of living like this for years, sharing your own home with men who had essentially invited themselves to live there indefinitely, watching them slaughter your livestock for feasts nearly every single day, listening to their voices filling a hall that used to hold quiet family evenings, and doing all of this while also raising a son alone, without any certainty that the husband you were waiting for was even still alive. Telemachus, for his part, grew up watching his mother endure this situation, watching grown men who should have shown him respect as the household's rightful heir instead treat him with condescension or outright dismissal. A young man forced to mature far more quickly than he might have otherwise, simply because the adults around him had failed to provide the stable, protected childhood he deserved. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, loyal servants like Eumaeus continued their own quiet, steady work, tending livestock, managing the practical daily labor that kept the kingdom's underlying economy functioning, even while its central household had become chaotic and unstable. There is something worth noticing in how this part of the story treats ordinary, unglamorous loyalty, servants who received no glory, no songs written about them, who simply continued doing their jobs faithfully year after year, hoping quietly that their absent king might someday return, without any guarantee that their patience would ever be rewarded at all. It is worth remembering, too, that Penelope and Telemachus had no reliable way of learning anything certain about Odysseus's fate during these years. No messages could reach them across all that distance and time, except through occasional travelers or traders who might have heard some fragment of rumor, usually unreliable, sometimes cruelly false, about ships lost at sea or Greek heroes who had died on their way home from Troy. Living for years inside that kind of uncertainty, not knowing whether to grieve or to hope, must have been its own particular, exhausting form of suffering, one that never gets the same dramatic attention as a battle with a Cyclops, but that shaped the daily emotional reality of this household every bit as powerfully. This is, I think, part of why Penelope's own patience deserves to be remembered as equal in weight to her husband's more famous cleverness and endurance. Odysseus, at least, always knew roughly what he was facing: a monster, a storm, a temptation, something immediate and identifiable that his mind could work against. Penelope faced something far more difficult to fight: an absence with no clear shape at all, stretching on for years with no end in sight, and she met that uncertainty not with despair, but with the same kind of careful, patient resourcefulness that eventually helped bring her husband safely home. With that fuller picture of what waited for him on Ithaca now settled in your mind, let's return to the shore where we left Odysseus, finally, physically home at last, though still with no idea yet of everything his absence had actually cost the people who loved him. Home, but not yet recognized the Phaeacian sailors, skilled and swift, brought Odysseus back to Ithaca while he slept deeply, exhausted after everything he had endured, and gently carried him ashore along with all his gifts before quietly sailing away again, so that when Odysseus finally woke, he did not even recognize the island he had spent 20 years trying to reach. This detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it captures something almost cruel about how long, difficult journeys often end, not with a triumphant, immediately recognizable homecoming, but with disorientation, uncertainty, and the strange, quiet work of having to reorient yourself entirely before anything can feel real again. It was the goddess Athena who had guided and protected Odysseus at various points throughout his journey, who now appeared to him disguised as a young shepherd, and explained to him where he actually was, confirming that this unfamiliar-looking shore was, in fact, his own long-sought home of Ithaca. She also delivered difficult news about the situation waiting for him there. During his 20 years away, 10 at war and 10 more wandering the seas, a large group of arrogant young men from Ithaca and the surrounding islands, believing Odysseus had died somewhere along the way, had taken up residence in his own household, competing aggressively for the hand of his wife Penelope in marriage, and in the process, eating through his stored food, drinking his wine, and generally treating his entire household as though it already belonged to whichever one of them eventually won her hand. I want you to imagine the particular kind of violation represented by this situation, because it goes far beyond simple romantic competition. In this culture, a household stored grain, wine, and livestock represented years of careful management and labor. The entire economic foundation a family depended on to survive through lean seasons and unpredictable harvests. These suitors, over the course of what had grown into roughly 3 years of this behavior by the time Odysseus finally returned, had been slaughtering Odysseus's cattle and pigs for daily feasts, drinking through his stored wine, and consuming his household's resources with no restraint at all while treating Penelope's continued refusal to choose one of them as a kind of stubborn inconvenience rather than a genuine, respected wish. Penelope herself, throughout these years, had employed her own quiet form of resistance and cleverness, a clear echo of the same resourceful intelligence that defined her husband. She had told the suitors that she would choose a new husband once she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father, Laertes, a reasonable and respectable request that no one could easily object to. But each night, once the suitors had gone to sleep or moved on to their own homes, she secretly unraveled the day's weaving, ensuring the shroud was never actually finished, buying herself years of additional time through this quiet, patient deception, until eventually one of her own servants betrayed the secret to the suitors, forcing her to finally complete the work and face renewed pressure to choose among them. I want you to imagine Penelope during these years, maintaining this exhausting daily ritual of weaving and secretly unweaving, managing a household under constant pressure and intrusion from men who refuse to leave, raising a son largely on her own, and holding on to a hope that most of the people around her had long since abandoned, that her husband was still alive somewhere and would eventually return. There is a particular kind of quiet heroism in this that the story clearly wants us to recognize. A heroism built not on monsters defeated or clever escapes from Cyclops, but on sheer, patient endurance sustained over years of genuine uncertainty. Athena, understanding how dangerous the situation had become, with more than 100 suitors occupying Odysseus's home, far too many for one man to simply confront directly and openly, devised a plan. She disguised Odysseus as an elderly, ragged beggar, transforming his appearance so completely that even people who had known him for years would fail to recognize him, and instructed him to make his way first not to his own palace, but to the humble hut of a loyal swineherd named Eumaeus, who had remained faithful to Odysseus's household throughout the entire 20 years of his absence, tending the pigs on a remote part of the island. I want you to imagine that hut for a moment, because it stands in such deliberate, quiet contrast to the chaos and excess happening at the palace nearby. A simple, sturdy structure built by Eumaeus's own hands, a stone-walled pen for pigs nearby, a modest hearth fire, simple meals, but genuine warmth and hospitality freely given to a stranger, exactly the kind of proper hospitality that Odysseus himself had once hoped for, and failed to find, in Polyphemus's cave so many years earlier. Eumaeus, not recognizing the ragged old beggar standing before him as his own long-lost king, nonetheless welcomed him in without hesitation, offered him food and a place by the fire, and spoke with real, unguarded grief about his missing master, whom he still hoped, against increasingly slim odds, might somehow still be alive. It must have been an extraordinary, painful experience for Odysseus, sitting disguised in his own swineherd's humble home, listening to a loyal servant speak with genuine sorrow and hope about him, unable yet to reveal who he truly was. This entire sequence, staying disguised even among people who genuinely still cared about him, was necessary caution given how dangerous the suitors had become. But it also gave Odysseus something valuable, a clear, honest picture of exactly who among his household had remained loyal during his long absence, and who had not. It was also here, at Eumaeus's humble hut, that Odysseus would soon be reunited with someone he had left as a helpless infant, and would now meet again as a grown young man he barely knew at all. Let's continue on to that reunion. A young man's own journey before we follow Telemachus back to Eumaeus's hut. I want to slow down and spend a little more time with the journey he took on his own, because it is easy to rush past it in favor of his father's more famous adventures, and yet it carries its own quiet importance, both for Telemachus's own growth and for helping us understand the wider political world these kingdoms existed within. Guided gently by Athena, who had disguised herself as an old family friend named Mentor to accompany him without drawing unwanted attention, Telemachus first sailed to the kingdom of Pylos, ruled by an elderly king named Nestor, who had also fought at Troy alongside Odysseus, and was, by this point in his long life, one of the oldest and most respected surviving figures from that entire generation of warriors. I want you to imagine Telemachus arriving at Nestor's palace, a young man who had grown up hearing stories about his father, but had never actually spoken with anyone who fought alongside him. Suddenly finding himself in the hall of a king who could offer first-hand memories, actual details, actual moments shared with the father Telemachus barely remembered. Nestor welcomed him with the same warm hospitality we have seen throughout this story, hosting a feast, offering him a place to sleep, and sharing long, detailed memories of the war at Troy and its immediate aftermath. Though he admitted honestly that he had no specific knowledge of what had happened to Odysseus after the fleet scattered following the war's end. Nestor did, however, share other important information, details about the difficult, often tragic homecomings experienced by several other Greek kings, including Agamemnon himself, who returned home from Troy only to be murdered in his own household through a plot involving his wife and her lover. A devastating piece of news that must have weighed heavily on young Telemachus, offering an unsettling reminder that even a triumphant homecoming from war was never actually guaranteed to be safe. From Pylos, Telemachus continued on to Sparta, to the palace of Menelaus himself, the very king whose wife's departure had started the entire war, and his wife Helen, now finally returned home after everything that had happened. I want you to imagine that particular household, a marriage that had survived not only a decade of war fought explicitly because of it, but the strange, complicated aftermath of Helen's return, the two of them now living together once more, hosting guests with what the old poem describes as genuine warmth and hospitality. Whatever private tensions might have remained unspoken beneath the surface of their restored household. Menelaus and Helen welcomed Telemachus generously, and it was here that Telemachus finally received the one piece of real, concrete information he had been searching for. Menelaus explained that during his own long, difficult journey home from Troy, he had been forced to capture and question a shape-shifting sea god named Proteus, who possessed knowledge of nearly everything happening across the wider world, and that Proteus had told him directly that Odysseus was alive, though trapped and grieving on a distant island, held there by the goddess Calypso, unable to continue his own journey home. This was the first genuine confirmation Telemachus had ever received that his father might truly still be alive, and I want you to imagine the particular mixture of relief and renewed longing that piece of news must have stirred in him, finally knowing his father was not dead, and yet still no closer to actually seeing him. It was while Telemachus was still in Sparta, absorbing this news, that events back on Ithaca and on Calypso's island were already moving forward without him, Zeus finally ordering Calypso to release Odysseus. The raft, the storm, the shipwreck, and the eventual arrival among the Phaeacians all unfolding, while the son remained unaware just how close his father actually was to finally coming home. Warned by Athena of the Suitors' ambush plot waiting for him on his return voyage, Telemachus made his way back to Ithaca by a careful, indirect route, arriving safely just as his father, guided by an entirely separate thread of the same unfolding story, was making his own way toward that same small island from a completely different direction. There is something worth sitting within the shape of this coincidence, two separate journeys, a father's and a son's, unfolding across entirely different parts of the ancient world, each shaped by different gods, different dangers, different lessons, and yet both converging, almost as if guided by fate itself, toward the exact same humble swineherd's hut on the exact same small island, at almost exactly the same time. Let's return to that hut now, and to the reunion we were building toward. Telemachus comes home, while Odysseus had been enduring his own long journey across storms and monsters and strange islands. His son Telemachus had grown up on Ithaca into a young man now in his early 20s, having spent his entire life without any real memory of the father who left for war when he was still an infant. During the years the suitors occupied his household, Telemachus had found himself in an increasingly difficult, humiliating position. A young prince, technically the heir to his father's kingdom, yet unable to force more than 100 grown men to leave his own home, watching helplessly as they consumed his family's wealth and disrespected his mother's wishes, all while he lacked the experience, the allies, and frankly the confidence to do anything meaningful about it. Guided by Athena, who had taken an interest in the young man much as she had in his father, Telemachus had recently set out on his own small journey, sailing to the courts of other Greek kings who had fought alongside Odysseus at Troy, hoping to learn any news at all of his father's fate. This journey, largely separate from Odysseus's own adventures, forms an important early section of the old poem, and it shows us a young man slowly growing into his own sense of purpose and identity, learning to speak with confidence among powerful kings, hearing first-hand accounts of the war his father fought in, and returning home with at least a little more maturity and resolve than when he left, even though he learned no definite news of whether his father was alive or dead. It was upon returning from this journey that Telemachus, guided again by Athena, made his way to Eumaeus's hut, the same humble dwelling where his disguised father was currently staying, arriving there not knowing that the ragged old beggar seated by the fire was anyone other than exactly what he appeared to be. Eumaeus greeted the young prince with visible warmth and relief, clearly having worried for his safety during the journey, especially since the suitors, growing increasingly desperate and aggressive as Telemachus matured into a potential threat to their plans, had actually plotted to ambush and kill him on his way home, a plot that failed only through luck and Athena's continued guidance. It was here, once Eumaeus had been sent briefly into town on an errand, that Athena appeared and transformed Odysseus's disguise, restoring him briefly to his true appearance, taller, stronger, and clearly regal once more, so that he could finally reveal himself to his own son. I want you to imagine that moment from Telemachus's perspective. A young man who had spent his entire conscious life without a father, suddenly confronted by a stranger who claims to be exactly that missing father, transformed almost magically before his eyes from a ragged beggar into someone who genuinely looks the part of a king. Telemachus's first instinct, understandably, was disbelief, assuming this must be some kind of trick or divine deception, since gods in this world were known to appear disguised among mortals for their own purposes. Odysseus had to work carefully to convince his own son that he was truly his father and not some divine trick, explaining that Athena herself had orchestrated this reveal. And slowly, tearfully, the two embraced, father and son finally reunited after 20 years of separation, one having left as an infant and grown into manhood entirely without him, the other having endured war and monsters and years of wandering just to reach this exact moment. The old poem describes both men weeping openly, with a kind of raw, unguarded grief and joy that even the most heroic figures in this story were never expected to hide or suppress, since strong emotion, expressed openly, was not seen as weakness in this culture the way it sometimes is treated today. Together, father and son began planning how to deal with the more than 100 suitors currently occupying their home, recognizing immediately that a direct, open confrontation would be suicide against such overwhelming numbers. Instead, they devised a careful plan built once again on Odysseus's particular gift for patience and disguise. Odysseus would return to his own palace still disguised as the ragged beggar, unrecognized by the suitors or even by most of his own household, and would wait, watching and gathering information, until the right moment arrived to strike. I want you to imagine the sheer discipline this required, walking back into your own home after 20 years away, being mocked, insulted, and even physically struck by arrogant young men who had no idea they were abusing their own rightful king, having to absorb all of it silently, patiently, waiting for exactly the right moment rather than acting on the immediate, understandable urge to reveal himself and take violent revenge on the spot. This patience, more than any single feat of strength or cleverness, may be the single quality that defines Odysseus most completely across this entire story. Let's follow him now, back into his own hall, disguised once more, to witness exactly what his household had become in his absence. A beggar in his own hall. I want you to imagine this for a moment. Odysseus, disguised once again as an old, ragged beggar, leaning on a rough walking staff, walked slowly up the familiar path toward his own home, a place he had not properly seen in 20 years, a home he had built and ruled before the war ever called him away. The hall itself would have been the largest structure in the household, a long room with a raised hearth at its center, smoke curling up toward an opening in the roof above, walls hung with weapons and trophies from years of hunting and earlier, more peaceful times. Now, instead of a quiet, orderly household, it was filled with the noise and chaos of more than 100 uninvited men, feasting daily on Odysseus's own livestock, drinking his stored wine, their loud laughter and careless behavior filling a space that had once belonged to a much smaller, quieter family. One of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire story happens right at this threshold, before Odysseus even enters the hall itself. Lying outside on a pile of dung near the gate, old, neglected, and infested with fleas, was Odysseus's own hunting dog, Argus, whom he had raised and trained as a puppy 20 years earlier, before ever leaving for Troy. Even now, aged nearly to death and clearly abandoned by a household too busy with its own crisis to properly care for an old, no longer useful animal, Argus recognized his master immediately, despite the disguise that had fooled his own son and closest servants. The old dog weakly lifted his head, wagged his tail, and then, having finally seen his master come home after 2 decades of waiting, quietly died right there at the gate. I want you to sit with that moment for a longer beat than usual, because it deserves it. Odysseus, forced to maintain his disguise, could not even openly grieve or acknowledge his own dog in that moment, and had to simply wipe away a tear and continue walking past, carrying that private grief silently into a hall full of strangers who had taken over his entire life. It is, in my opinion, one of the most emotionally honest details the ancient poets ever included in this story. A reminder that loyalty and love, even from an animal, could outlast 20 years of absence and total physical transformation, and that homecoming, even a triumphant one, always arrives carrying its own small, unavoidable griefs alongside it. Inside the hall, Odysseus, still disguised, was treated exactly as an anonymous beggar would be expected to be treated by men with no particular reason to be kind. Some of the suitors mocked him outright, threw scraps of food at him, and one particularly arrogant suitor named Antinous even struck him with a footstool when Odysseus, in character as a beggar, pushed back against his disrespect. Odysseus absorbed all of this with remarkable, practiced patience, watching carefully, learning which suitors behaved with at least some restraint and decency, and which behaved with outright cruelty, information that would matter enormously very soon. Penelope herself, still unaware that this ragged beggar was actually her long-lost husband, spoke with him at length during this period, curious about this stranger who claimed to have news of Odysseus from his travels. Their conversation, described at real length in the old poem, is worth pausing on, because it shows two people who clearly recognize something meaningful in each other, even without conscious recognition, testing each other carefully, speaking indirectly, each perhaps sensing more than they could yet consciously admit. Penelope, in fact, told the disguised Odysseus about a dream she had recently had, of an eagle swooping down and killing a flock of geese she kept in her yard, and Odysseus, still disguised, interpreted the dream for her exactly as it would soon come true, that the eagle represented her husband returning to destroy the suitors who had overrun her home, though Penelope herself remained uncertain whether to trust such an interpretation after so many years of disappointment. It was also during this stay that Odysseus was almost accidentally revealed, in a small, tense moment that must have set his nerves on edge. An elderly servant named Eurycleia, who had actually nursed Odysseus himself as an infant decades earlier, was given the task of washing the visiting beggar's feet, a standard act of hospitality in this culture. While washing his legs, her fingers passed directly over the old boar hunting scar above his knee, the very same scar from that hunt on Mount Parnassus so many years before. She recognized it instantly, gasped, and nearly dropped his leg in shock, and Odysseus had to quickly grab her by the throat and beg her, quietly and urgently, to keep his secret, which, loyal to the end, she did, without revealing a word to anyone else in the household. With his identity still concealed from everyone except this one old servant, and secretly his own son, Odysseus was now closer than ever to the moment he had been waiting for, a moment that Penelope herself, still not knowing who she was truly speaking to, was about to set in motion with a contest of her own devising. Let's move now toward that contest, and the great bow that only one man in the entire hall would be able to string. The contest of the bow under continued pressure from the suitors to finally choose a new husband, and perhaps sensing, on some level she could not fully articulate, that something significant was shifting within her own household, Penelope announced a contest, one final test to determine which of the suitors, if any, deserved to marry her. She brought out Odysseus's own great hunting bow, a weapon he had owned since before the war, one that no one in the current household had the strength or skill to even properly string, let alone fire with any accuracy. The challenge was simple to state and, as it turned out, nearly impossible for anyone present to actually accomplish. Whoever could string the bow and then successfully shoot an arrow cleanly through the aligned handle holes of 12 axe heads set up in a row, an extraordinarily difficult feat of both strength and precision, would win her hand in marriage. I want you to imagine that scene. The great hall filled with more than 100 confident, arrogant young men, each one absolutely certain that he would be the one to succeed, each one deeply unwilling to be the first to try and potentially fail in front of everyone else. One by one, the suitors attempted to string the bow, and one by one, they failed entirely, unable even to bend it enough to attach the string, some of them warming the wood by the fire first, hoping that might soften it enough to work, all without success. It must have been, in its own way, a quietly humiliating spectacle, watching more than 100 men who had spent years arrogantly occupying someone else's home fail, one after another, at a physical task that their absent host had apparently once performed with ease. It was at this point that the disguised beggar, still sitting quietly among the lower guests, asked for a chance to try the bow himself, a request the suitors mocked with real contempt, insisting that it would be humiliating to let some wandering old vagrant even touch a weapon that stronger, younger men had already failed to handle. Telemachus, in on the secret and playing his part carefully, insisted that his mother's guest be allowed to try, framing it as a simple matter of hospitality rather than revealing any deeper knowledge of who this particular guest truly was. Odysseus took up his own bow, and in a moment the old poem describes with real, quiet satisfaction, strung it as easily and effortlessly as a skilled musician might string a lyre, a task the suitors had struggled with for hours, done by its true owner in a matter of seconds. He then took an arrow, drew the bowstring back, and fired it cleanly through the aligned holes of all 12 axe heads in a single, perfect shot, exactly as he must have done countless times in the years before the war. Only once this was accomplished, once the bow was proven to be back in the hands of its rightful owner, did Odysseus finally reveal himself completely, throwing off his beggar's rags, and what followed was swift, decisive, and violent. Turning the bow now toward the suitors themselves rather than the target, Odysseus, along with Telemachus and the small handful of loyal servants who had remained faithful throughout his absence, including Eumaeus the swineherd, began systematically killing the suitors who had spent years abusing his hospitality, consuming his household's wealth, and disrespecting his wife's wishes. I want you to sit with the sheer scale and intensity of what followed, because the old poem does not soften it at all. More than 100 armed young men, trapped inside a single hall with only a few exits, faced a small, determined group led by a man with 2 decades of war experience and nothing left to lose. It was chaotic, brutal, and by the poem's own account, deeply satisfying to Odysseus and his allies after everything they had endured, though it is worth noting even now, 3,000 years later, how uncomfortable this kind of overwhelming, decisive violence can feel to modern sensibilities, a reminder that ancient standards of justice, particularly regarding hospitality violated on this scale, operated under very different assumptions than our own. By the end of the fighting, every single suitor lay dead in Odysseus's own hall, along with a small number of disloyal servants who had aided them or mistreated the household during his absence, while those who had remained genuinely loyal throughout the 20 years, people like Eumaeus and the old nurse Eurycleia, were spared and rewarded for their faithfulness. It was, by any measure, an overwhelming, total reclamation of everything that had been taken from him, achieved not through the kind of open battlefield heroism that defined the Trojan War itself, but through exactly the same patient, careful, disguised cunning that had defined nearly every major victory of his entire journey home. With his hall finally cleared and his household reclaimed, only one final reunion remained, the one that mattered more to Odysseus than perhaps any other moment in this entire 20-year ordeal. Let's go to Penelope now. The reunion with Penelope. News of the slaughter in the hall reached Penelope quickly, carried up to her private chambers by the old nurse Eurycleia, who burst in with the extraordinary claim that the ragged beggar Penelope had spoken with only days earlier was, in fact, her long-lost husband, and that he had just killed every single suitor occupying their home. Penelope's reaction to this news is one of the most psychologically careful, believable moments in the entire poem, because rather than rushing down in immediate joy and certainty, she remained deeply cautious, unwilling to let herself believe something so overwhelming without real proof. After 20 years of false hopes, false rumors, and the constant risk of being deceived or manipulated by people with their own motives. I want you to imagine her state of mind in that moment, sitting in her private chamber upstairs, hearing that the man she had waited 2 decades for might finally be standing in her own hall below, and yet holding herself back from simply believing it, because believing it and being wrong again might be more than she could bear after everything she had already endured. This caution, far from being a flaw in her character, is treated by the old poem as one of her greatest strengths, the same careful, patient intelligence that had allowed her to outmaneuver the suitors for years through the trick of the unfinished shroud. When she finally came down to see this man for herself, she found Odysseus sitting quietly by the hearth, freshly bathed and dressed, his disguise finally gone, looking every bit like the king who had left for war 20 years earlier. And yet she still did not immediately embrace him, choosing instead to sit across from him in silence, studying him carefully, testing whether this truly was her husband or merely someone who resembled him closely enough to be dangerous. Telemachus, watching his own mother's hesitation, grew frustrated and questioned why she would not simply welcome his father home. But Odysseus himself understood something his son did not yet fully grasp, that Penelope's caution was not coldness, but the exact same careful, deliberate intelligence that had defined his own survival throughout the entire journey, and he respected it rather than resenting it. Finally, Penelope devised one last test, quietly instructing a servant to move the bed from their private bedchamber out into the main hall so that Odysseus might rest there. Odysseus reacted immediately and with genuine alarm, protesting that this was impossible, because he himself had built that bed years earlier around the trunk of a living olive tree that grew rooted directly into the ground, carving one of the bedposts from the still living trunk itself, meaning the bed could never actually be moved without literally cutting it apart. This was a secret known only to Odysseus, Penelope, and one trusted servant, a detail so specific and personal that no impostor could possibly have known it. Hearing this answer, Penelope's careful composure finally broke, and she rushed to embrace her husband at last, weeping openly. 20 years of uncertainty and patient waiting finally resolving into the simple, overwhelming relief of having him truly, verifiably home again. I want you to sit with the quiet cleverness of that final test, because it mirrors so much of what has come before in this story. A bed literally rooted into living earth, immovable, permanent. A physical symbol of a marriage that had survived 20 years of separation without ever actually breaking, no matter how many suitors had tried to convince Penelope otherwise. The two spent that night finally reunited, and the old poem describes them staying up long into the night simply talking, Odysseus sharing the full account of everything that had happened to him across those 20 years, Penelope sharing everything that had happened on Ithaca during his absence, two people slowly, carefully rebuilding a shared understanding of each other after 2 decades spent living entirely separate lives. It is worth noting how much value this old story places on that quiet act of simply talking and listening to each other, treating it as every bit as important to a genuine homecoming as any battle or clever escape that came before it. There remained one more reunion still ahead of Odysseus, one final piece of his old life waiting to be restored. An aging father who had spent years grieving a son he believed was likely dead. Let's go find Laertes now, working alone in his orchard. The old man in the orchard the next morning, Odysseus made his way out to the countryside, to a small, modest farm where his elderly father, Laertes, had chosen to live out his final years. This detail alone tells us something meaningful about what had happened to this family during Odysseus's long absence. Laertes, once a king himself before passing rule of Ithaca to his son, had apparently withdrawn from the palace entirely at some point during the years of uncertainty and grief over his missing son, choosing instead to live simply, working the land with his own hands, tending a modest orchard rather than remaining in a household increasingly overrun by disrespectful suitors. I want you to imagine that scene. An old man, once a king, now dressed in simple, patched clothing, his hands roughened from years of physical labor, working alone among his fruit trees, tending vines and fig trees and rows of vegetables with the same careful attention any farmer of this era would give to land that needed to feed a household through an uncertain year. There is something deeply poignant in this image, a former king reduced not by poverty exactly, but by grief and by a kind of quiet withdrawal from a world that had taken his son from him, choosing the honest, grounding labor of farming over the empty comfort of a palace he could no longer bear to occupy fully. When Odysseus found him working there, bent over among the trees, he did not reveal himself immediately, testing his father gently first, the way he had tested so many others throughout this final stretch of his journey, perhaps out of long habit built from years of necessary caution, or perhaps simply needing a moment to observe his father's grief up close before revealing that it was finally, truly over. He asked the old man about the orchard, admiring the careful rows of trees and Laertes, not recognizing his own son standing before him, spoke with visible sorrow about a son he feared was surely dead by now, lost somewhere far from home after all these years of silence. Unable to maintain the disguise any longer in the face of his father's genuine, unhealed grief, Odysseus finally revealed himself, and to offer proof beyond mere words, he pointed out a specific scar on his body, then recounted specific details about the orchard itself, exact trees his father had given him as a boy, 13 pear trees, 10 apple trees, 40 fig trees, details so precise and personal that only a genuine father and son could have shared them. Laertes, overwhelmed, initially nearly fainted from the shock and joy of this revelation, before finally embracing his son fully, 20 years of accumulated grief finally, completely lifted in a single overwhelming moment. I want you to sit with this particular reunion a little longer than the others, because there is something especially tender about an elderly parent finally getting to see a child return home safely after believing, for years, that such a reunion would never come. It is a scene that would have resonated with any ancient listener who had ever sent a son off to war, or waited for news that never seemed to arrive, and it resonates just as clearly today. This idea that even after the longest, most uncertain absence, love and hope can still be rewarded, even if only after far more waiting and suffering than anyone should reasonably have to bear. With Odysseus finally reunited with his wife, his son, and his father, and with the suitors who had plagued his household finally dealt with, the story of his return was, in most practical senses, complete. And yet, if you remember all the way back to that misty shore at the edge of the Underworld, you might recall that the prophet Tiresias had warned of one final task still waiting for him, even after everything else was finally settled. Let's close out the story now, with that final journey, and with a quiet look at what became of Odysseus in the years that followed. The oar in the forest, and a quiet life at last according to the version of the story that continues past the ending most people know. Odysseus did not simply settle immediately into peaceful rule over Ithaca. Remember the prophecy Tiresias gave him in the Underworld, that final, strange instruction to take up an oar from his ship and walk inland, away from the sea entirely, until he came upon people who had never seen a ship or an oar in their lives, people who might mistake the oar for a simple farming tool used for winnowing grain. Only when he found such a place, planting the oar upright in the earth and offering a proper sacrifice to Poseidon there, would he finally make lasting peace with the sea god who had tormented him for so much of his journey. I want you to imagine what this final journey might have looked like. An aging Odysseus, having finally reclaimed his home and his family, setting out once more, not toward danger this time, but toward a kind of quiet, symbolic penance, walking further inland than he had ever gone in his life, away from the sound of waves and the smell of salt air that had defined nearly every experience of the previous 20 years, into a completely different world of inland farmers who had built their entire lives without any real relationship to the sea at all. There is something quietly moving in imagining that contrast. A man whose entire adult life had been shaped by ships and storms and sea monsters, walking finally into silence, into landlocked fields, carrying an oar that a stranger might genuinely mistake for a farm implement. Once he found such a place and completed the sacrifice, Odysseus was finally free of Poseidon's anger, free at last of the consequence set in motion so many years earlier by that single moment of pride outside Polyphemus's cave, when he could not resist shouting his own name back at a blinded, humiliated giant. It is worth sitting, one final time, with how much suffering grew out of that one small, human need to be recognized and remembered, and how much quiet peace was finally required to undo it. According to most versions of this tradition, Odysseus returned home from this final journey and lived out the remainder of his life in relative peace on Ithaca, ruling his small, rocky kingdom alongside Penelope, watching Telemachus grow further into his own role as heir, finally allowed the simple, ordinary life that had been denied to him for 2 full decades of war and wandering. Different ancient sources offer slightly different accounts of exactly how his life eventually ended, some describing a peaceful death in old age, others involving a strange, tragic twist connecting back to Circe's island. But what matters most for our purposes tonight is simply this, that after 20 years of nearly unimaginable hardship, Odysseus was finally allowed to rest. I think that is worth sitting with for a long, quiet moment before we close out tonight's story. This entire journey from the walls of Troy to Ithaca's own shore was never really a story about a man defeating monsters for glory or fame. It was a story about a man who wanted nothing more in the end than to return to an ordinary life, a wife who had waited for him, a son he barely knew, an aging father tending an orchard, a small, rocky island that was never especially wealthy or powerful, but was simply, completely his own. Every clever trick, every act of patient endurance, every quiet decision to survive rather than to fight when fighting made no sense, all of it was in service of that one simple, deeply human goal, getting home. Let's spend just a little more time together before we close out tonight, thinking about why this particular story has lasted so long, and why it still means something to people listening to it quietly in the dark, nearly 3,000 years later. A word that outlasted an empire before we talk about why this particular story has endured for so long. I want to point out something small and quietly wonderful, which is how deeply this one man's journey has worked its way into the everyday language so many of us still use without even thinking about where it came from. The very word we use today to describe any long, eventful, difficult journey, an Odyssey, comes directly from this story, from Odysseus's own name. When someone today describes a difficult year, a long, complicated move across the country, or even a frustrating trip through a crowded airport as an Odyssey, they are, in a small and mostly unconscious way, reaching back nearly 3,000 years to borrow the shape of this exact story. a long, uncertain journey filled with obstacles standing between a person and where they are actually trying to go. It is a strange, quiet kind of immortality, more durable in some ways than any statue or temple. This idea living on inside the ordinary vocabulary people reach for almost without noticing. The Romans, who absorbed and adapted a great deal of Greek mythology into their own culture, renamed Odysseus as Ulysses, and under that name he continued appearing in Roman poetry for centuries afterward, sometimes as a heroic figure, though interestingly, several Roman writers treated him with more suspicion than the Greeks generally had, uncomfortable with a hero whose greatest strength was deception rather than straightforward honesty and courage. This slight shift says something interesting about how different cultures valued different qualities in their heroes. The Greeks generally comfortable celebrating cleverness and strategic deception as admirable, practical virtues, while later Roman tradition sometimes viewed that same cleverness with a bit more moral unease. Centuries later, the name Ulysses would be borrowed again for one of the most famous and challenging novels of the 20th century, written by the Irish author James Joyce, who structured his entire enormous, experimental book loosely around the events of Odysseus's journey, compressed into a single ordinary day in Dublin, following an ordinary man through ordinary errands and encounters that quietly echo, in strange and inventive ways, the ancient hero's much longer and more fantastical journey. It is a lovely, strange kind of tribute, this idea that an ordinary day, handled with enough care and attention, might actually contain the same essential emotional shape as an epic, decade-long voyage across a mythical sea. Painters across the centuries have returned again and again to specific scenes from this story, Odysseus bound to the mast, while his men row past the Sirens, the blinding of Polyphemus, the emotional reunion with Penelope, each generation finding its own way to visually reimagine moments that were first only ever spoken aloud, never originally intended to be seen at all, only heard, late at night, around a fire very much like the one we have been imagining together this whole evening. Even now, in our own time, filmmakers and television writers continue returning to this same material, reshaping and reinterpreting it for new audiences who may never read a single line of the original ancient poem, and yet who still, in some form, encounter this exact story. A man trying desperately to get home, a wife waiting with remarkable patience, a son growing up in his father's long absence, monsters and temptations along the way that test not just strength, but character. It says something meaningful, I think, about which stories manage to survive across so many centuries and so many different cultures, that the ones which endure longest are so often the ones built around experiences nearly everyone can recognize in their own life: longing, patience, temptation, loyalty, and the particular relief of finally, after everything, coming home. Why this story has lasted so long, it is worth pausing, near the end of a story like this one, to think about how it actually reached us at all. Remember that this entire tale, every storm, every monster, every quiet reunion, existed for hundreds of years only as spoken performance, carried by traveling singers who memorized enormous amounts of poetry and adjusted their telling slightly each time depending on their audience, their mood, and how long they had to fill an evening. It was only sometime around the 8th century before the Common Era that these oral traditions were finally set down in writing, in the form we now call the Odyssey, traditionally attributed to a poet named Homer, though scholars today still debate exactly who Homer was, whether he was a single individual or a name attached to a much longer tradition of collective storytelling, passed down across many generations. What strikes me most, sitting with this story tonight, is how much of it is built around such ordinary, universal human experiences, dressed up in gods and monsters, but recognizable underneath all of that. The ache of being away from home for too long, the particular loneliness of being offered comfort that still cannot replace what you actually want. The complicated, patient work of two people trying to trust each other again after years of separation and uncertainty. The quiet grief of an old dog who simply wanted to see his master one last time before he died. None of these details require you to believe in cyclopes or sea gods to feel their weight, and I suspect that is a large part of why this story has survived for nearly 3,000 years. Read and reread, performed and reperformed, across cultures and centuries that otherwise had almost nothing in common with the Bronze Age Greek world that first produced it. There is also something worth noticing in how this story treats intelligence and patience as being every bit as heroic as physical strength, if not more so. Odysseus is remembered today, above almost anything else, for his cleverness, for finding a way through situations that could not be solved through force alone. In a world of ancient epics filled with warriors defined mostly by their raw physical power, there is something quietly refreshing about a hero whose greatest weapon was always his own mind, his ability to observe carefully, wait patiently, and act at exactly the right moment rather than the most immediately satisfying one. And I think, too, about Penelope, whose own quiet, patient intelligence mirrors her husband's so closely, weaving and unweaving that shroud night after night for years, testing a disguised stranger carefully before allowing herself to hope, holding an entire household together through sheer persistence during a period when almost everyone around her had already given up on her husband's return. Their reunion works in the end precisely because they are so genuinely well matched, two people whose particular strengths, patience, cleverness, careful observation, happen to align perfectly with one another. Before we bring tonight's story to a close, I would love to know something, if you happen to still be awake enough to leave a comment before you drift off. I always find it fascinating to think about how far this small YouTube channel actually reaches. So if you feel like it, let me know down in the comments where in the world you happen to be listening from tonight, and what time it happens to be for you right now. I have had people tell me they are listening from small towns in the middle of the country at just past midnight, and others tell me they are listening on their lunch break on the other side of the world in the middle of the afternoon. There is something quietly comforting to me in knowing that this small story about a man crossing an ancient sea to get home is reaching so many different homes, at so many different hours, all at once. No pressure at all if you are already too relaxed to type anything. That is honestly the whole point. Let's bring this evening to a gentle close now. A last look at that ancient world before we close entirely. I want to take one more slow walk through the physical world this story actually took place in, because I think it helps to hold onto these details as you drift off tonight, the small, textured realities of daily life that made up the background of every single event we have followed together this evening. Think for a moment about light. In our world, light is instant and effortless. A switch flipped, a screen glowing in the dark. In Odysseus's world, light after sunset meant an open flame and nothing else. A hearth fire burning wood or, in some regions, dried animal dung when wood was scarce, throwing warm, flickering, uneven light across a room, never bright enough to read comfortably by even if reading had been common, which for most people it was not. Oil lamps, small clay vessels holding olive oil with a floating wick, offered a slightly more portable light source. But oil was valuable, so lamps were used sparingly, often only in wealthier households or for special occasions. Most evenings, once true darkness fell, ordinary people simply stopped their work and went to sleep, their days shaped entirely by the natural rhythm of sunrise and sunset in a way that almost nobody in the modern world experiences anymore. Think about sound. No engines, no electrical hum, no distant traffic. The sounds of this world were the creak of wooden ships and carts, the bleating of goats and sheep being moved between pastures, the rhythmic thud of a loom's weights as a weaver worked, the crackle of hearth fires, human voices carrying much further in a world with so much less competing noise, footsteps on packed earth or stone rather than pavement, the particular slap and hiss of oars moving through water, the creak of leather and rope on a moving ship. It must have been, by our standards, an extraordinarily quiet world, punctuated by these specific, recognizable sounds, rather than the constant low background noise most of us live inside without even noticing anymore. Think about clothing. Odysseus and the people around him would have worn garments made from wool or linen, woven by hand on upright looms exactly like the one we imagined at the very beginning of tonight's story, dyed using plant and mineral sources when color was desired. Though undyed, natural cream and brown tones were far more common for everyday wear. A basic tunic called a chiton, wrapped and pinned rather than sewn into a fitted shape the way modern clothing is constructed, with a heavier cloak added in cold weather, wrapped and draped rather than buttoned or zipped, since neither of those fastenings existed yet. Sandals made of leather straps for those who could afford them, bare feet for many others, particularly around the home or in warmer weather. Think about food, something we touched on earlier but that deserves one more quiet pass. Bread made from barley more often than wheat, since barley grew more reliably in the thin, rocky Greek soil. Olives and olive oil, absolutely central to the entire diet and economy of this region, used for cooking, for lamps, for trade, for offerings to the gods. Cheese made from goat or sheep milk, since cow's milk was far less commonly consumed in this region. Wine, always diluted with water, sometimes mixed with honey or herbs, consumed at almost every meal in small quantities. Fish for coastal communities like Ithaca, a genuinely important and regular source of protein, caught daily from small boats using hand lines and woven nets. Meat, as we mentioned, reserved mostly for special occasions and religious sacrifices, since livestock alive was simply too valuable for milk, wool, and labor to slaughter casually for an ordinary meal. I want you to sit with how different this all is from the world most of us move through every single day, and yet how recognizable the underlying shape of it still feels. People still gathered around fire for warmth and company. People still told stories to pass long evenings. People still worried about food, about family, about whether the people they loved would come home safely. People still fell in love, grieved deeply, waited patiently for news, and found quiet, ordinary comfort in small daily rituals, weaving, cooking, tending animals, mending nets, that gave shape and rhythm to lives that otherwise had very little certainty in them at all. That, I think, is the real gift this ancient story still offers us. 3,000 years after it was first sung aloud in halls very much like the one Odysseus finally returned to. Underneath the gods and monsters and magic, it is simply a story about people, about the particular ache of separation and the particular relief of homecoming, about patience rewarded and pride punished, about love that manages somehow, against extraordinary odds, to endure. And with that, buddy, I think we will let Odysseus rest now, finally home on his quiet little island, sitting by his own hearth, surrounded by the people who waited so patiently for him. I hope, if you are still with me at this point, that your own body has settled somewhere close to sleep by now, your breathing slower, your thoughts a little softer around the edges than they were when we started this journey together tonight. If you enjoyed spending this evening with Odysseus and his long, strange road home, I would be grateful if you considered subscribing to the channel, so these long, quiet stories can keep finding their way to you on future nights when you need something calm to drift off to. And if you already did that earlier, thank you truly for letting a small story like this one into your evening. If you have a moment left in you before sleep fully takes over, feel free to drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what time it happens to be there right now. I always love reading those in the morning, knowing this little story reached so many different corners of the world while everyone else was asleep. Wherever you are tonight, whatever kind of day brought you here, I hope you rest well. I hope, like Odysseus, whatever long journey you happen to be in the middle of right now eventually brings you somewhere that feels like home. Close your eyes now if they are not already closed. Let the fire in your mind burn low. And I will see you again, buddy, next time with another story to help carry you gently into sleep. Good night.